Chapter 135. It was just noon. After lunch, Dean went back to the scattering training ground to continue his practice. 81 Delta, Chinese Delta, net in the afternoon. The young instructor came to see Dudian. He was surprised but didn't say anything. After watching Dudian's archery practice, he pointed out a few minor flaws in Dudian's posture and left. In the evening, Dudian returned to the dormitory and began to review the law books that he had borrowed from the library. The next day, Dean got up on time. After breakfast, he found the young instructor and asked for leave. "You're asking for leave again?" The young instructor frowned. "Although you are an official hunter, but there is a time limit for the current skill training. You can't neglect it. Yesterday, you were allowed to take a day off. It was an exception. What's the matter today?" Dean knew that it would not work if he didn't explain a reason. He said, "Yesterday, I went to the magistrate's recruitment and passed the preliminary exam. Today I will go to the official exam." Apprentice priest recruitment? The young instructor was surprised. Every time there was a big event in the magistrate, it was a big event. He had naturally heard about yesterday's news, but he didn't expect that Dudian would ask for leave for this reason. The young instructor looked at Dudian suspiciously. "Have you studied the law? To pass the magistrate's probationary magistrate's examination doesn't just require a little knowledge of the law. You need to be proficient in it. Even many people who have graduated from law school find it difficult to meet the requirements." "I'll try." Dean wasn't too sure. The young instructor thought for a moment and said, "All right, I wish you success." Dean was overjoyed and said, "Thank you, instructor. Go, come back early." The young instructor waved his hand. Dudian turned and left. He went outside the headquarters to find a carriage and went straight to Puss Avenue. Puss Avenue was located in the central block of the bustling West District of the Commercial District. The price of every meter of land here was enough to buy a small building in a small town outside the suburbs of the Commercial District. It was not an exaggeration to say that every inch of land was worth its weight in gold. The people living in the central area of the Western District were either rich or of high status. Elegant and high-end shops were everywhere. Noble women could be seen walking in and out of jewelry stores with their children and pets in their arms. The carriage stopped in front of Puss Avenue's magistrate. Unlike the neighboring streets, there weren't many people on the street. It was deserted. In the middle of the street, there was a towering building. It was about 30 meters tall, and it looked like a giant black beast. The top half of the building was shaped like a sharp gourd, and on the top of the sharp horn, there was a huge cross sign. The cross, in the canon of the Light Church, represented purification. Dudian saw magistrates wearing white robes along the way. They were holding law books in their hands. They were reading attentively while walking. "I'm here to take the exam." Dean walked down the stairs to the solemn and gloomy magistrate. He took out the card and said to the magistrate guard. The young magistrate guard glanced at the card indifferently and nodded. "Please come in." Dean entered the magistrate. The lobby on the first floor was extremely spacious. Rays of light were projected from the dome. Dean looked up and saw that there were white crystal-like objects inlaid in the dome. He was surprised. As he was looking around, a white silk-robed maid came over and gently said, "You're here to take the exam. Please come with me." Under her lead, Dean came to the lobby. There was a cathedral-like hall with rows of seats. There was an independent podium in front of it. At the moment, there were more than a dozen figures sitting in the hall. All of them were boys and girls of his age. Most of them were dressed in gorgeous, bright colors, and the fabric was mainly silk. Only 2 or 3 of them were dressed in linen and woolen materials. In front of the independent podium, there were several tables. At the moment, there was no one behind the tables. There were several white-robed maids waiting respectfully. Dean randomly found a remote seat. After a moment, he suddenly smelled Jenny's scent. His heart was happy. It didn't take long for him to see Jenny wearing a green silk dress. Dean immediately stood up and waved to her. Jenny was choosing a seat when she suddenly noticed Dean. Her eyes lit up. She quickly walked over and sat on the seat next to Dean. "You're early." Jenny lowered her voice after sitting down. Dudian laughed. "The early bird gets the worm." "What about the early worm?" Jenny slyly asked. Dean choked and laughed. "Eaten by the bird." Jenny covered her mouth and giggled. She asked. Are you ready? Yes, Dean confidently said. As long as I know how to take the exam, I'll get full marks. Ginny giggled. While the two were talking and laughing, the other candidates continued to come. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, the nearly 5-meter-high door behind the examination room was slowly pushed and closed by two attendants. At this time, a small door at the front of the examination room opened, and 4 figures wearing white robes with golden embroidery walked out. There were 2 men and 2 women, and the youngest among them was around 30 years old. Their expressions were cold and solemn, and they didn't like to smile. Silence. One of the old men in his 50s said coldly. The venue was silent. The exam time is 1 hour. The old man waved to the maid next to him. The latter handed an hourglass and put on the table. The old man pressed his palm on the hourglass and looked around at the crowd. I hope you remember what kind of quality a magistrate should have. If I see anyone trying to cheat, you will be punished according to the law. You will be detained for a month. Dozens of people in the audience looked at each other and didn't dare to make a sound. Duddian winked at Ginny. Ginny was nervous, but when she saw Dean's funny expression, she couldn't help but smile. After a moment, the exam began. The hourglass turned upside down, and the sand slowly passed. Dean looked at the paper in his hand, holding the quill pen to answer. He had seen many of the questions, so he wrote the answers after thinking a little. However, there were still some questions that gave him a headache. He only felt that he had seen them vaguely, but he couldn't remember them clearly. After all, his knowledge of the law was completely from the scavenger special training. He squeezed out a little time every day to learn. If you're the proposed legal person, what do you think the law needs to be improved? Dean looked at the last question and slightly raised his eyebrows. This question tested the overall understanding of the law. If the content of the answer was the law that had been implemented or the law that had been abolished in the early days, it would naturally expose that his understanding of the law was not comprehensive enough. Dean thought for a moment, but still decided to write. If I am the proposed legal person, the first rule will be to abolish slavery and aristocracy. If you want to achieve equality in front of the law, you must achieve equality in the value of life. There is no distinction between high and low. Time's up. At this time, the old man in front of him shouted. Dean immediately put down the pen. Ginny, who was next to him, also quickly looked at him. Both of them exchanged glances and immediately understood that the other side had finished the paper. After a moment, the papers were collected. Everyone, please go back and wait for the notice in 3 days. The old man said. The door was pulled open, and the others left one after another. Dean said to Jenny, Shall I send you back? Jenny's face reddened. My aunt sent me here today. She is waiting for me outside. Dean smiled. See you in 3 days. Okay. The two said goodbye to each other at the gate. Dean looked at Jenny, who was taken away by a lady in a white velvet coat. They sat in a spacious and exquisite aristocratic carriage. Dean retracted his eyes and entered his own carriage to leave. After returning to the hunter headquarters, Dean saw that it was still early, so he went back to the scattering field to continue practicing. The young instructor saw him and asked him about the exam. Finally, he told him not to be distracted and to focus on his duties as a hunter. In the blink of an eye, 3 days had passed. Dean said goodbye to the young instructor in advance. After breakfast, he left the hunter headquarters and drove to the magistrate. There were dozens of other people waiting for the results on the same day. It was still early when Dean arrived. He didn't wait for long before he saw Jenny's carriage coming from the end of the street. After a moment, the door of the carriage opened. Jenny walked out of the carriage with the help of a knight of the Bourong family. She looked up at the crowd for a moment and soon saw Dean's figure. Both of them smiled as they looked at each other. You are early. Jenny came forward and smiled. Dean winked. The early hunter gets the bird. Jenny suddenly remembered the words of the last time and couldn't help but laugh. The two of them chatted in low voices. A moment later, the door to the magistrate court opened and a serious-looking old man stepped forward. He read out the names one by one. Anyone whose name was read out represented that they had passed the exam and were now apprentice priests. Jenny Bourong, the old man read out. Jenny was relieved when she heard her name. She patted her chest with a happy face. Dean, the old man read out again. Dean was also relieved. When he handed him the answer sheet, his heart was hanging because he knew that he was not sure of the answers to several questions. He was purely relying on luck, but he didn't expect that he would still be qualified. Great! Jenny clapped in surprise when she heard Dean's name. Dean saw her happy appearance, and his heart was warm. He smiled. We will work together in the future. Jenny's face reddened. Do you still want to be a scavenger? Dean was surprised. He couldn't help but think of the desolate and cruel scene outside the giant wall. Now that he had obtained the status of a trainee, as long as he wanted, he could completely leave the hunter establishment and live the life of a trainee. Or he could be an ordinary person, just like Peter and other senior members of the scavenger headquarters. Most of them were retired hunters. He hesitated as he thought of this. No one liked to live a precarious life of killing. Even senior hunters were in danger of dying outside the giant wall. Jenny suddenly realized that this was a choice that would determine his future. She hesitated for a moment. If it's too dangerous outside the giant wall, as my father said, then I think you should not go. Dean looked up at her. There was a moment of impulse in his heart. He wanted to agree, but in the end he shook his head slightly. I don't want to live inside the giant wall. Jenny stared at him and suddenly smiled. I knew that I didn't read the wrong person. Dean saw that she wasn't angry. He was relieved and smiled. I also didn't read the wrong person. Soon after, the two of them received their status badges as trainees. When they received their badges, they also learned from the old man about their official reporting date and the basic rules for trainees. The basic principles were the same as the purpose of the magistrate. There were three main things: fairness, justice, and openness. I'll go back first. Jenny waved to Dean and got into the carriage. Dean watched her leave. He also returned to his carriage and set off for the hunter's headquarters. The duties of a trainee were the same as that of an ordinary worker. They needed to work 8 hours a day in the magistrate. If their performance was excellent, then they would be promoted to senior trainee. Then they wouldn't need to report to the magistrate every day. They only needed to accompany their superiors and assist them in dealing with the law cases in various areas. 8 hours. In this case, there isn't much time for hunter training. Dean slightly frowned and murmured, however, if I don't want to be promoted to a senior trainee or a senior trainee, then I don't need to report every day. In that case, I will always be a junior trainee and can only do odd jobs in a magistrate. However, I just want the identity of a trainee. In this way, there will be a layer of protection for my life inside the giant wall. Moreover, it will be convenient for future alchemy activities. Thinking of this, Dean immediately decided to focus on the hunter. After all, the hunter's ability to earn gold coins was far from that of a trainee. It was high risk and high reward. After returning to the hunter's headquarters, Dean went to the scattering training ground and continued to practice. Chapter 136. Time passed day by day. Dean's scattering skills were getting more and more proficient. He was able to quickly pull out arrows and shoot at 4 targets at the same time. From the first time he learned scattering to the present, it only took him half a month. The young instructor was very happy to see Dean's amazing progress. Then he continued to teach Dean other hunter skills. They were lurking, tracking, and crossbow. Lurking included how to eliminate the sound of one's movements, cover up the smell, and quickly change positions. In addition to using undead powder to cover up the smell outside the giant wall, he also needed to rely on himself. After all, some monsters like to hunt undead. If he blindly smeared undead powder, it would be courting death. At this time, he needed to use other things to cover up the smell. These things included plant juice, rotten mud, crushed insect corpses mixed with soil or vines, and so on. Tracking was based on footprints, movement traces of the monster, and so on to determine the monster's whereabouts. This was a knowledge lesson. After all, not all hunters had perceptual magic marks. Crossbow was only used when hunting large monsters or destroying a demon's nest. According to the young instructor, a beginner hunter only needed to master one of bow and crossbow. When an intermediate hunter became an intermediate hunter, they would learn heavy crossbow. Once they mastered the heavy crossbow, their damage would increase by several times, and they would also have the ability to fight in close combat. Once the enemy was close, they could use the heavy crossbow to shoot them back to gain more time to attack. After all, the essence of a hunter was the control of distance. If there is enough distance, then there will be enough opportunity to attack. This was what the young instructor repeatedly emphasized to Dean, so that he would remember. Dean studied seriously. He also realized that after 300 years of development, the hunter profession within the giant wall had long been perfected. The division was extremely meticulous. During the hunter training, Dean took the time to see Jura and her husband. He saw that they had moved to the new house in the commercial district and found their respective jobs in the small town. Jura worked 8 hours a day in the medical center. Gray was the same. He worked in a tailor shop in the small town. The income was stable and the work was very easy. It was much happier than the previous factory. He didn't have to work overtime every day. Occasionally, he could take a vacation. Moreover, the salary was at least twice as much as before. Dean saw that their lives had stabilized, so he was no longer worried. A month later, he took the time to return to the slums and found Barton and Crone. After not seeing each other for a long time, they had found a remote, abandoned factory. Because it was too remote and desolate, they did not have to spend money to buy it. Instead, they bought a batch of building materials and cleaned the abandoned factory. They repaired the walls and many broken workbenches. Dean thought that they had gone their separate ways after such a long time. He didn't expect that they were still busy with the things he had told them. He was touched and trusted them more. Here are 100 gold coins. The main purpose of Dean's return was to let them collect materials. This is the list of materials. You can buy them and pile them up here. The quantity is written on it. Barton and others looked at the big bag of gold coins in Dean's hand. Their eyes lit up as they swallowed their saliva. Barton said, Dean, where did you get this money? How come you have so much? I risked my life to get it. How else could I get it? Dean smiled. Barton and the others glanced at each other, thinking that he was right. Crone's face turned red as he looked at the list. Dean, there are some words that we don't know. Dean thought for a moment and said, well, you should study first. Once you know more words, you could drop out of school and work for me. But the tuition. Barton hesitated. Crone touched him. Dean laughed. Of course I will pay for the tuition. I will leave the money with you, and you could distribute it among yourselves. Although 100 gold coins was a large number, but it was nothing for him. Moreover, he wanted to quickly cultivate Barton and others. First of all, he wanted them to have the ability to manage money and restrain their desire for money. If they had run away with 100 gold coins, Dean could have withdrawn early. Hearing Dean's words, several people's eyes lit up with excitement. Barton was happy but hesitated. It's a lot of money. If we lose it, it depends on your ability. Dean laughed. They looked at each other with a solemn expression. After lunch, Dean went back to the commercial district by car. In his heart, there was still some worry. Although Barton and others were alert and clever, but they were too young and needed to be cultivated. At the same time, he had to prepare a way out for himself. In addition to the daily and boring hunter training, Dean would go to the magistrate once a month to avoid being disqualified as a trainee. Dean would see Jenny every time he went to the magistrate. Every time he chatted with this girl, Dean would feel very good. It was as if he had found another version of himself. He found that Jenny was completely different from other noble girls. She was not snobbish at all, and her character was very easygoing. From hobbies to ideals, they talked about almost everything. Dean came to the magistrate more often. Sometimes he would come 3 to 4 times a month or even more. In the blink of an eye, more than half a year had passed. Dean came out of the magistrate's office on Puss Avenue. He looked at the gray sky. It was the black snow season, so the air was particularly cold. The particles in the thick radioactive clouds blocked the sun. Even during the daytime, the weather was gray. From time to time, black snowflakes would fall on the houses and the streets. The passers-by were scared and hurried to avoid them. Black snow was the same as the disaster rain. It was an existence that people avoided. The wind outside is so strong. Jenny, who came out from the back, tightened her woolen coat, and her rosy cheeks immediately faded a little. Dean saw her pale face and felt sorry for her. He took off his coat and put it on her shoulders. He asked, "Are you still cold?" Ginny was a little anxious and quickly said, "Put it on quickly. You'll freeze." "I'm not cold." Dean smiled and felt warm in his heart. "You are a liar." Ginny bit her lower lip. There was a layer of mist in her eyes. She said, "The last time it rained, you covered me from the rain, but you got wet. The result was that you got sick the next day." Dean froze for a moment. He didn't expect her to remember this matter. It was 3 months ago. It was the Black Death season. The temperature was extremely high and there was very little rain. That day was Ginny's vacation day. The two had an appointment to go out to play, but it suddenly rained. He didn't expect that with his physique, he would catch a cold. It could be seen that even if he had the physique of a hunter, he would have to retreat in the face of the rain. "Why are you so good to me?" Ginny grabbed Dean's clothes and looked up at him. Dean looked at her sparkling eyes. His heart was warm. He couldn't help but say, "Because I like you." After that, he felt his heartbeat stop. The whole world seemed to be quiet in an instant. He couldn't help but feel a trace of regret in his heart. But he was more nervous and looking forward to it. Ginny didn't expect Dean to suddenly confess. She was stunned for a moment. Her cheeks suddenly turned crimson. She lowered her head and whispered, "I like you too." Dean's hearing was very good. He felt as if his brain was going to explode. Endless joy rushed into his mind. His blood seemed to be boiling. He felt that the cold wind outside was as warm as the spring breeze. He was surprised. Really? Ginny saw Dean's excited and happy appearance. Her cheeks became redder, but she didn't avoid it. She softly said, "Yes." Dean suddenly felt unprecedented happiness. It was as if he was surrounded by the whole world. He held the girl tightly in his arms and smelled the faint fragrance of her hair. His heart was full of emotions. After a long time, the two separated. "I'll send you back," Dean said happily. Ginny's face was still red. She gently nodded. Dean looked at the carriage and knights waiting for Ginny in the distance. There was a trace of a smile in his eyes. "But we have to take a detour." Then he took Ginny's hand and went around to the side to sneak away. Ginny's face became redder. She closely followed him. That night, Dean sent Ginny to the front of the castle. He waited for her to enter the castle before returning to his residence. He was excited along the way. He couldn't wait to punch a few times in the carriage or immediately find a bow and arrow to shoot thousands of arrows. Half a month later, Ginny was sorting out books in the library of the magistrate in Phillips Avenue. This was her job as a trainee priest. Dean was also here, standing on the ladder, helping her to sort the books and put them on the bookshelf. After sorting out the books, Dean went down the ladder and whispered to Ginny, "I have a surprise for you. Close your eyes first." "Huh?" Ginny was puzzled, but seeing Dean's smiling face, she slowly closed her eyes. Her eyelashes trembled slightly. She looked very beautiful under the faint beam of light. Dean took out something from his pocket and put it in front of her eyes. "You can open your eyes now." Ginny opened her eyes and saw a jade bracelet. She was pleasantly surprised. "How do you know that I like jade?" "You mentioned it 2 months ago." Dean laughed. Ginny took the jade bracelet. Her body slightly trembled as she heard Dean's words. She tiptoed and quickly kissed Dean's cheek. Dean was stunned. He covered his face. His heart was pounding and his blood was pumping. Ginny blushed and lowered her head. Dean excitedly looked at her. He was about to hug her when his face suddenly changed. He hurriedly said, "Someone is coming." Ginny was also shocked. She quickly put away the bracelet and turned around to quickly sort out the books. Dean grabbed the ladder and adjusted the angle. After a moment, a young priest came and looked at Dean and Ginny. "Do you know where the history of the slave law is?" Dean raised his hand and pointed. "It's on that shelf." "Oh, thanks." The young man turned his head, took a look, and casually said before leaving. Dean and Ginny looked at each other and snickered. Bourron family's castle. One of them was a very spacious and luxurious room. There were 2 rows of tall bookshelves filled with books. There were some antique porcelain and carvings next to them. There were rare oil paintings on the wall. At the moment, a middle-aged figure was sitting on the sofa. He was holding a book in his hand. He looked at the middle-aged butler in front of him. "I heard that Miss has been very close to a trainee priest recently." The middle-aged butler heard the dull tone of his voice. He was a little scared. "Yes, master. Go and investigate the background of that person." The middle-aged figure indifferently said, "Yes." The middle-aged butler quickly complied. In the blink of an eye, a year had passed. Duddian stood on the side of the street, patiently waiting for Moss's arrival. Suddenly, a familiar smell floated into his nose. His eyes lit up. After a moment, he saw an exquisite carriage coming from the end of the street and stopped in front of Dean. Jenny jumped out of the carriage and threw herself into Dean's arms. She happily said, "I have good news for you. Do you want to hear it?" Dean held her body and laughed. "What's the good news?" "It's a great thing." Jenny blinked her eyes. She couldn't suppress the excitement on her face. "My father agreed to let us be together." "Agreed?" Dean was surprised. When Jenny's father knew that he and Jenny were together, he sent people to make him leave. They threatened him and tempted him with a lot of money. But Dean didn't agree. Because of his identity as a trainee priest, the other side didn't use brutal means. Later on, the matter was left unsettled. Now, after so long, the other side agreed. Looking at Dean's skeptical expression, Jenny nodded. "My father said that he refused you before not because you are a civilian, but because he was worried that you are useless. You can't be a priest or a hunter. So he said that this time he will personally arrange a hunting task for you. If you can complete it, he will agree to let us be together." "Personally arrange a hunting task for me?" Dean slightly frowned. His heart felt a trace of unease. His identity as a hunter had long been known by the other side. If he didn't have the protection of a trainee priest, it was estimated that he would have been forcibly separated by the other side. Jenny saw Dean's worried expression and laughed. "You can rest assured that my father said that he will never arrange a task that is too difficult for you. But I don't know the specific task. If you think it is difficult, you can tell me. If my father is deliberately making things difficult for you, see if I don't find him to settle accounts." "Well," Dean nodded. He hoped so. Chapter 137. After the completion of this task, you don't have to be a hunter anymore, okay? Jenny looked up at Dean, full of expectation. Now a year had passed. She knew that Dean was no longer a scavenger, but a hunter, although she was not interested in the consortium's business. But more or less she knew that the hunter's duty was to clear the dangers outside the giant wall. In the past, she would unconditionally support Dean to do what he wanted to do. But now the feelings were deep. She did not want to see Dean leave the giant wall again when she thought that Dean would encounter danger. Looking at her hopeful eyes, Dean's heart softened. He nodded. "Okay." Jenny couldn't help but be overjoyed. She hugged him tightly and buried her head in his arms. "In the future, we will be magistrates. We will be together every day. How happy it will be." Dean's heart was full of yearning when he heard her words. The more he fell in love with this girl, the more he did not want to face the life outside the giant wall. He even did not want to practice archery. When he was shooting, his mind was full of her figure. It was difficult to concentrate his thoughts. He just wanted to accompany her every day and look at her forever. Since the two fell in love 6 months ago, Dean would go to the magistrate to accompany Jenny back to her home every day after completing his training. Whenever Jenny had a holiday, he would take a leave to accompany her to play around. In such a life, he found himself tired of the boring archery practice. Even the alchemy factory that was ready was abandoned. He did not go back to visit for a long time. Dean felt tired every time he thought of his ideals and ambitions. He just wanted to accompany the girl every day. He did not want to go outside the giant wall and train hard. "My father will give you a task in a few days. You go back and prepare for it. I won't bother you." Jenny raised her head from Dean's chest and looked at him. Dean smiled and said, "You are quite sensible." "Of course," Jenny proudly said. Dean also felt that he needed to prepare well. Since the other party had given him this opportunity, he had to grasp it. If the task was beyond his ability, he would decisively refuse. But if it was just a little difficult, he was willing to fight to prove to Jenny's father that he was worthy of his daughter's life. 2 days later, Dean received a notice that he was assigned to the third team to carry out a mission outside the giant wall. The content of the mission was to head to Zone 2 and slay the named monster of Zone 2, Corpse Eater. Corpse Eater. Dean frowned as he read the content of the mission. The captain of the third team is an intermediate hunter and a knight. The ghoul's hunting level is 18. With the captain's strength, he should be able to resist one or two of them. With the cooperation of the others and me, the chance of killing it should be about 60%. During this year of training, he had taken the time to read the atlas of the monsters outside the giant wall. It was said that this atlas was passed down from the inner wall. It recorded the basic information of the various monsters outside the giant wall. Moreover, according to this information, he was able to evaluate the hunting level of the monsters. In a long history of development, there would be some deviation between the hunting level and the actual combat power of the monsters in the early days, but now the deviation was very small. It was basically in line with the estimated hunting level, and the deviation would not be more than one level. After thinking for a moment, Dean immediately decided to execute it. Although it was difficult, but it was not without hope. Duddian packed his luggage. He put the detonator that he had secretly prepared 6 months ago into his bag. It might be useful in a critical moment. After all, the fortress in Area Number 7 should have been scavenged by now. Basically, there wouldn't be anything left. When Dean came to the Hunter's Hall, he immediately saw the third team. There were a total of 4 people, including him. This was the standard size of team. Moreover, the position allocation was also very particular. Each team must have a knight or a defensive warrior, and the same was true for hunters. The remaining 3 vacancies could be filled at will, either 2 thieves or 3 knights. Are you Dean? Among the 4 people, a tall youth took the initiative to ask when he saw Dean. Dean said apologetically, "Sorry, I'm late." Another female hunter in her early 20s was carrying a crossbow on her back. She looked at the newcomer and could not help but say, "What is going on? The people above have drunk too much. This is assessed as an intermediate task. How could they let a rookie join the mission? Do they think our lives are worth shit?" "That's right, Captain. Could the higher-ups have made a mistake?" Another warrior carrying a giant sword said. From the shape of the sword, it was clear that most of them were defensive swordsmen, not offensive swordsmen like Linda. "This is the decision of the top. Don't talk about it. Get ready to go." The tall youth slightly waved his hand to stop the 2 from continuing to talk. He said to Dean, "I heard that your magic marks are fear. The task of tracking the ghouls will be handed over to you." Dean nodded. "No problem." The female hunter and the young swordsman were stunned for a moment when they heard the captain's words. They looked at each other, but didn't continue to say anything. They just coldly snorted. There was still a bit of dissatisfaction in their eyes. Soon, everyone got on the horse. The tall youth captain took the lead and went out of the giant wall. After a few hours of travel, they passed through the radiation zone and arrived in front of the giant wall. In front of the passage, there were people from the Melon Consortium waiting for them. When they saw Dean and others, they immediately greeted and helped to open the passage. As they passed through the dark passage, Dean followed the others. As usual, he stopped in front of the goddess of the hunt, engraved on the wall, and prayed. Then he left the passage and came to the outside of the giant wall. This passage was different from the passage that Dean had used to go to Area Number 1. Outside was not a giant forest, but a desolate plain. The ground was full of rubble. Under the rubble, the outline of the foundation of the building was faintly visible. "Let's go." It was obviously not the first time for the tall youth to come here. After a quick glance, he confirmed that there was no danger around. He took out a map from his backpack and looked at it. He took the lead to lead the way. Dean, the female hunter, the swordsman, and the other thief followed closely behind. "Rookie, if you smell any dangerous smell, remember to remind us," the swordsman said to Dean. Dean frowned but didn't say anything. The ghoul's favorite area of activity is the carrion swamp on the north side. The tall youth said to the crowd, "Hurry up. There are traces of other monsters wandering nearby. It's a big guy." Chapter 138. Under the leadership of the tall youth, they quickly moved forward in the rubble. Along the way, they saw some huge footprints, which were about the size of a bathtub. It It was not difficult to imagine what kind of giant creature passed by here. 81 Chinese, network Dean, smelled the residual smell on the footprints. Through the tracking of the smell, he smelled the source of the smell in the distance of about 25 to 30 miles. It was extremely strong and moving slowly. The tall youth flew in the opposite direction of the footprints with Dean and others. They came to a broken street and stopped, saying, "Let's take a break. Dean, come over and look at the map. We have to rely on you to track the ghoul." Dean heard the words and went forward to look. Suddenly, the tall youth suddenly turned around, pulled out a dagger, and violently stabbed Dean's chest. This sudden change shocked Dean. Clang! A sharp sound echoed. Dean flew out and fell to the ground. The tall youth was a little stunned. He looked at Dean's chest. The black hunting armor had been pierced, but the inside was extremely hard, like a layer of steel plate. This sudden turn of events left the huntress, swordsman, and thief completely dumbfounded. "Captain," the female hunter was a little confused. Dean was horrified. He looked at the tall youth incredulously. The next moment, he suddenly thought of an idea. His whole body suddenly turned cold. He quickly climbed up from the ground, turned around, and ran. The hunting mission this time was simply a pretense, or the target of the hunt was not the ghoul, but him. The tall youth saw Dean escape, and hurriedly said to the swordsman and the other two, "Catch him. This is the consortium's task. We must kill him." The swordsman and the other two looked at each other, but did not move. The tall youth didn't say much to them and quickly chased after Dean. He thought that after the sneak attack was successful, he would slowly explain to them. But now the sneak attack failed. If he let a newcomer like Dean run away from his hands, it would be a big joke, and it would also anger the people above. Whoosh! The tall youth ran. Although he was a knight, his flexibility was not inferior to the thief and the hunter. Dean felt that the figure behind him was getting closer and closer. He was frightened. He had no chance of winning against an intermediate hunter. He hurriedly threw out the life bag on his back. Although there was a detonator inside, it was too late to ignite. It was just a burden. Run. Dean ran for his life. Whoosh! Suddenly, a sound of breaking wind swept over. When Dean heard the sound of the wind, he instinctively wanted to look back, but an alarm sounded in his mind. He couldn't look back, and his body took the lead to hide to the side. Although he dodged quickly, a piercing pain still came from his back. It was as if a truck had hit him from behind. His body involuntarily fell forward and rolled several times on the ground. At this time, Dean saw that the tall youth was quickly catching up. He also saw the tip of the spear from his back to his abdomen. Dean's eyes were red. Enduring the pain, he pulled out the spear from his back. Blood gushed out and sputtered on the ground. Humph! The tall youth coldly snorted, quickly rushed in front of Dean, and kicked. Dean suddenly rolled sideways, grabbed a handful of mud, and threw it at the tall youth's face. The tall youth hurriedly raised his hand to block, but his foot stepped on empty air. When he looked again, Dean had climbed up and continued to run forward. Damn brat! The tall youth gritted his teeth, grabbed the spear that was thrown on the ground by Dean, aimed at the running Dean, and threw it. Dean covered the wound on his abdomen and endured the pain. Although he was running, his mind was always paying attention to the back. Seeing that the other side picked up the spear, he immediately knew that the other side was going to throw the spear again. He immediately endured the fear and continued to run along the straight line. Then suddenly, he rolled to the side to dodge. With a whoosh, the moment he dodged, the spear whizzed past him and shot into the distance. Dean's wildly beating heart was slightly relieved. Then he gritted his teeth and ran to the side of the street. The tall youth froze for a moment. It seemed that he didn't expect Dean to suddenly dodge. Originally, he saw Dean running in a straight line, so he thought that the spear would hit. Who would have expected that the other side's action turned out to deliberately lead him to misjudge? Damn it! The tall youth reacted and suddenly became angry. He no longer picked up the spear and quickly chased after Dean. Dean only felt the pain in his abdomen. In the process of running, it seemed that something was constantly leaking out of his body, which made his heart feel frightened. He could only cover his abdomen more tightly. What should I do? What should I do? Dean was a little flustered. He knew that sooner or later he would be caught. Just now, he used the opponent's spear to pull away a little bit. But the opponent was, after all, an intermediate hunter. The distance between them was too close. It was impossible to get rid of him. Whoosh! The tall youth rushed to catch up. He looked at Dean in front of him, who was covering his abdomen with one hand and running in the air with the other. His heart was angry and somewhat frightened. Such speed was by no means a newcomer could have. Dean was faster than many junior hunters and not much inferior to him. The two of them ran on the street covered with moss, water, and mud. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Soon, Dean smelled the opponent's scent. He was 3 or 4 meters behind him, and it was already within reach. Is this the end? A trace of despair flashed in Dean's heart. In vain, he saw a puddle on the side of the road in front of him. This was a collapsed street filled with accumulated rain. Fallen leaves and dark rotten things were floating on top of it. The water was muddy. Dean gritted his teeth and jumped. With a splash, he fell into the puddle. The tall youth stretched out his hand to grab the air. He was slightly stunned and quickly stopped. Looking at the puddle of 7 or 8 square meters, his eyes became gloomy. I wanted to leave you a whole body, but you actually courted death. You let the monster in the sewer take advantage of you. He looked at the water and waited. 10 seconds later, a lot of blood floated up from the muddy water. Dean plunged into the puddle. The first thing he felt was cold. The puddle was deep. He swam quickly and drilled into the puddle, for fear that the tall youth would also jump in. After swimming for a while, Dean suddenly saw a black shadow, quietly and quickly swimming towards him. There were almost no fluctuations in the water as it swam. An underwater monster. Dean's pupils shrank. He suddenly remembered that this was a sewer. Now that it was filled with water, there must be a lot of monsters living in the sewer for a long time. Thinking of this, his heart was cold. At this time, the black shadow was about 4 or 5 meters away from him. It swam quickly like a hungry tiger, pouncing on its prey. Dean tried to open his eyes. In the muddy water, he only felt pain in his eyes, but he still did not dare to close them. Suddenly, he saw the appearance of the black shadow. It turned out to be a crocodile-like monster. Its whole body was covered with fish scales. Its front mouth was extremely long. There were 6 extremely sharp claws under its abdomen. It was estimated that it could instantly tear a human body apart. Dean kicked the water and wanted to escape in horror. But the opponent's underwater speed was too fast. It rushed forward and fiercely bit Dean's left leg with its big mouth full of sharp teeth. A sharp pain came from his left leg. Dean painfully shook his leg, but the opponent tightly bit him. He suddenly thought of the dagger beside his leg. He hurriedly took it out and madly bent down to stab the monster's head. The dagger stabbed down again and again. The monster's tail shook violently in pain, and the surrounding water surged. Dean crazily stabbed, and a lot of blood floated out of the monster's head. It didn't take long for the monster's tight bite to loosen its strength. Dean hurriedly opened its upper and lower jaws and pulled out his leg. At the same time, he felt a sense of suffocation in his chest. Knowing that his holding time was almost up, he hurriedly looked around. Soon, Dean found a hole in the wall and hurriedly swam toward it. The hole was a drain leading to the sewer. Dudian pulled the rotting steel bars across the hole. The steel bars were broken with a gentle pull. Dudian immediately drilled into the hole. The hole was facing upwards. Dean looked inside for a moment and finally surfaced. He couldn't help but gasp for breath. At the same time, he saw the surrounding environment. It turned out to be a moss-covered toilet. The tall youth looked at the water in the puddle. As the water surged, a lot of blood floated out and dyed the turbid water light red. At this time, the hunter and others caught up and looked at the blood in the puddle. They looked at the tall youth in bewilderment. "Captain, why?" The tall man tilted his head to look at them and said indifferently, "This is a mission from the higher-ups, and it's from the blonde family. Each of you will be given 1,000 gold coins to keep your mouth shut. You'd better not leak what happened today, or I won't be able to protect you." The hunter and the other two looked at each other. Dean didn't dare to break the toilet. The distance between him and the tall youth was less than 20 meters. It was easy to alarm the tall youth. He vaguely remembered that there were several collapsed buildings nearby. He should have come to one of the buildings along the sewer. He gently gasped. He didn't dare to let his breath be too loud. His body was still soaked in the water. His palms were tightly covering the side of his abdomen. After soaking in the water, he felt that the wound on his back was getting more and more painful. It seemed that blood was constantly flowing out of it. After a moment, Dean smelled the scent of the hunter and others. He immediately held his breath and sank his head into the water again. He didn't dare to make the slightest movement. He was afraid that they had perceptive magic marks and could find his position. When he couldn't hold his breath again, Dean carefully floated his head out of the water. He controlled his chest to slowly inhale a trace of air. At the same time, he smelled their scent. He felt that they were still in front of the puddle. He couldn't help but feel a little nervous. He faintly felt that it was too dangerous here. He immediately took a deep breath and sank into the water. He continued to swim along the previous hole. He secretly prayed that he wouldn't encounter underwater monsters again. He swam along the wall of the sewer. Although the light inside was dim, fortunately, his vision wasn't affected by the darkness. After swimming for more than 10 meters, he saw a huge seaweed-like monster in the distance. Its whole body was floating like seaweed-like tentacles. The monster seemed to smell the blood on his body. It immediately swam over slowly. Dean was scared and stopped in a hurry. He looked around and saw another hole similar to the previous one. He immediately drilled into it. After entering this passage, Dean quickly swam up. The position exposed to the water was still a toilet, but this toilet had long been smashed. The surroundings were flat. Dean saw a rotten and dark skeleton not far away. The ground was full of rotten dust and some unknown monster feces. At this time, Dean smelled the smell of the tall youth and others in front of the puddle. He turned back along the original road. It seemed that they were worried about the underwater monster and gave up jumping into search. After all, Dean was seriously injured and there was blood on his body. The hope of surviving underwater was close to zero. Moreover, although these hunters often went outside the giant wall to hunt monsters, they didn't know the structure under the ruins of the city. Dean quietly felt that they had gone far away. His tense heart also relaxed. At this moment, he felt pain in his feet. Then countless cold and soft things wrapped around his legs and climbed all the way to his upper body. Dean suddenly thought of the seaweed-like underwater monster. He was scared and hurriedly climbed out of the toilet. Although the area under the toilet was very small, the surrounding ground had been soaked in water. The concrete had long been rotten. Dean pushed hard and broke a hole. He crawled out and looked back. He saw that the tentacles of the seaweed-like monster were like green snakes. The top of the tentacles opened a sharp mouth and gnawed his body. Fortunately, he had the hunter armor to block, so he wasn't bitten too seriously. Dean felt numb. He held the dagger and madly stabbed it. The monster was in pain. The green snake-like tentacles bit Dean's face. Dean hurriedly waved the dagger and cut off. The monster screamed in pain. The tentacles wrapped around Dean's body suddenly retracted. Its body slid into the puddle near the toilet. Blood floated on the surface of the water. Dean was relieved when he saw that the monster was scared away. He didn't dare to stay here any longer. He carefully climbed out of the collapsed building. I have to deal with the wound as soon as possible. Dean felt the pain in his thighs and back. His face was ugly, but he didn't dare to stay in the vicinity for a long time. He didn't want the monster to suddenly turn back. He took off the hunter armor and threw it into the roadside water. Then he took out a soaked gauze from the first aid kit and wrapped it around the wound. He found some vines and green leaves and crushed them. He let the plant juice mix with the bloody smell to suppress the spread of the blood. Then he washed the blood off the hunter armor and smeared mud on it. He put it on his body. The smell of rotten mud wafted from his body. I have to leave here as soon as possible. Once I'm targeted by a large monster, I'll be dead. Dean was very nervous. Concealing the smell was a relatively safer method. But in front of some level hunter monsters, this kind of camouflage was useless. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dean appeared at the border of Area Number 2. From the surrounding buildings, he could vaguely see the flag of the Melon Consortium. There was also the emblem of fuel sprayed on the ground. It symbolized that this was the territory of the Melon Consortium. In front is area number 9. From area number 6, I can go to area number 9. Dean crossed a flag, clutched his abdomen, and limped into area number 6. In the past 2 days, he almost didn't dare to clean the wounds on his body. All the first aid items on his body were soaked in the water and lost their effect. Only a few bottles of hemostatic medicine had a little effect, but the wound was infected by the water and had rotted. He had to cut off the wound and bandage it. Cutting off the festering tissue also meant that there would be a bloody smell. In a dangerous area like area number 2, Dean could only endure the rotting of the wound. He only hoped to return to area number 9 as soon as possible. It was the closest safe area to him. I didn't expect that his purpose was to kill me and not to test me. Dean's heart was full of pain and sadness. He thought that his father-in-law was really merciful. Like Jenny said, he didn't despise his civilian identity. He didn't expect that he was too naive and overestimated his value. In the eyes of the other, he may be a humble worm. How could he allow such a worm to drag down his daughter? This matter, Jenny shouldn't know. Dean recalled Jenny's happy appearance before leaving. From her every move, it was obvious that she was kept in the dark. This made his heart feel a lot better. Before returning to the giant wall, I have to improve my strength as soon as possible. Otherwise, he will send consortium assassins to assassinate me. Even a magistrate won't be able to help me. At most, the consortium will lose an assassin. Dean secretly said, as long as I am careful of his plot, even if he is a noble, he has no right to kill me. After all, the magistrate has executed nobles in the history of the magistrate. He won't dare to take such a risk. When the time comes, I will promote the position of the clergyman and take Jenny away. Dean secretly calculated. Chapter 139. 3 days later. At the border of Melon Consortium's 9th area, a dirty and muddy figure drilled out of the grass. He looked around and saw that there was no danger. He carefully groped his way out. He stepped barefoot on the moss and limped into the ruins of the street in front of him. Finally back to the 9th area. Dean's tense body finally got a little breathing space. In the past few days, if he didn't rely on his sense of smell to detect monsters and undeads in advance, it was estimated that hundreds of lives would have been lost. Even so, he almost lost his life. At night, he was attacked by a snake that knew how to hide its smell. Fortunately, he reacted in time and didn't get entangled by it. Otherwise, he would have lost his life. Following the route in his memory, Dean walked towards the place where the cold crystals were stored. Along the way, he smelled the scent of bone-biter rats from the ruins of collapsed buildings. In addition, he smelled the scent of other monsters from the entrance of the sewer. Although hunters could hunt monsters on land, they couldn't do anything to monsters underwater. Some people had tried to kill them with poison, but the water in the sewers flowed in all directions. It was estimated that even if they threw in tons of poison, they might not be able to kill the monsters. Moreover, with the mutation of the monsters, if they were not killed immediately, they might evolve again and become more terrible. After a moment, Dean found his hiding place. He lifted the stone and found the cold crystals and rotten guns wrapped inside. Dean put the guns aside and opened the package of cold crystals. Looking at the crystal, he couldn't help but think of its original name, Soul Crystal. Perhaps this was really the soul of the undeads. Dean shook his head and put away his thoughts. He lifted his left sleeve and held the dagger. Suddenly, there was some hesitation in his heart. If it was not necessary, he really didn't want to absorb the cold crystals to enhance his strength. He always felt that something bad would happen. However, now he was forced into a desperate situation. If he didn't enhance his strength, he couldn't return to the giant wall. If he stayed outside for a long time, the radiation in his body would increase sharply. Dean gritted his teeth and cut a wound on his wrist. He picked up a cold crystal and immediately blocked the wound. The next moment, he saw that the cold crystal was like ice and snow in boiling water. It gradually melted and turned into a translucent, viscous liquid. It slowly penetrated into the wound on his arm. In the blink of an eye, a cold crystal the size of a ping-pong ball disappeared from the bloodstain. Dean felt the cold crystal near the bloodstain was full of power. He gritted his teeth and picked up the second cold crystal to continue to absorb. After the second one disappeared, Dean continued to absorb the third one, fourth one. In the blink of an eye, 90 cold crystals had entered his left hand and disappeared. His arm didn't show any signs of swelling or any other signs. Dean looked at the remaining 10 pills in the bag. He immediately picked them up and pressed them on the bloodstains. The cold crystal slowly melted and flowed into his arm. When Dean grabbed another one, he suddenly felt a cold air coming from the bloodstain on his left hand. At the same time, a swollen discomfort came from his left hand and stomach. He felt nausea and vomiting. His brain also felt a trace of fatigue and dizziness. He had experienced such a reaction last time when he absorbed the cold crystal. He knew that he had reached the limit. He immediately let go of the cold crystal in his hand and stopped absorbing. He hugged his left arm and leaned against the wall, quietly waiting for the uncomfortable reaction to subside. However, this time it didn't go as Dean expected. The uncomfortable feeling of dizziness and vomiting, as well as the bone-chilling feeling, not only didn't weaken, but became more and more intense. Dean felt like he was in the black snow season, surrounded by endless ice and snow. He was so cold that he was shivering. Kaka! Suddenly, Dean heard the bone-chilling sound of ice. He looked at the source of the sound and suddenly turned pale. He saw that his left hand had started to freeze from the fingertips. Moreover, the frozen ice slowly spread along the fingers to the palm and then the wrist. Looking at the trend, it seemed to spread along the left hand to the whole body. Dean was frightened and hurriedly covered the frozen part of his left wrist. Suddenly, he felt the bone-chilling cold pouring into his right hand. The ice covered his right hand. He was scared and hurriedly pulled back his right hand. Looking at the ice still spreading up, his mind was a little blank. In this moment of panic, he suddenly thought of fire. The best way to stop the cold was to use fire. His right hand hurriedly took out the fire sickle hidden in the chest armor that he carried with him. His other hand held the fire sickle and rubbed it with all his might. Soon, sparks were ignited. He picked up the dry firewood on the ground next to him, bit the silk with his teeth, and threw it on the sparks. It gradually burned. He kept picking up the nearby fallen leaves and withered vines, stacking them on the sparks and burning them. The fire was getting bigger and bigger. However, Dean saw that on his left hand, the ice was still spreading up to his elbow. The cold feeling of his whole body was not warmed by the strong flame. Suddenly, he gritted his teeth, made up his mind, and stretched his left hand to the flame. The ice on his hand melted quickly when it met the raging fire, and there was a burst of sharp pain from his arm. The pain was not from the burning flame, but from the inside of his arm, as if it was being stabbed by countless ice knives. Dean took back his left hand and hugged it, rolling on the ground in pain. After the flames fell off his arm, the piercing pain immediately lessened. However, the ice that had stopped spreading once again followed his arm and extended towards his shoulder. This made him feel terrified. He didn't know if it would continue to spread after it reached his shoulder. If it froze his throat, he would suffocate to death. Dean gritted his teeth and raised his left hand again, grilling it on the fire. The ice gradually melted into water, dripped into the fire, evaporated into water vapor, and made a hissing sound. A bone-piercing pain came from his left hand. He was in so much pain that he wanted to scratch his scalp. He tried his best to pull his hand back, but he resisted the urge to do so. He picked up a thick piece of firewood from the ground and bit it tightly. The sharp pain made him lose all restraint, and he let out a beast-like howl from his throat. Tears were secreted from his tear ducts and flowed all over his face. Bean-sized beads of cold sweat also seeped from his forehead, mixed with tears. In such a painful endurance, he did not feel the passage of time. He did not know how much time had passed. Maybe it was more than 10 minutes, maybe less than a minute. Gradually, he felt the piercing pain in his left hand lessen, and then slowly he could not feel the stinging pain anymore. His eyelids trembled and slowly opened. The next moment, he saw his left hand was on fire, The hunter armor on his hand was made of animal skin, and it was burning. His arm was like a fire stick. Dean was scared and hurriedly retracted his hand. Soon, the flame was extinguished, and black smoke rose from his left hand. Dean raised his left hand and looked at it. He found that the skin of his left hand was only slightly burned, but the hunter armor on his left hand was burned to rags. He was relieved, but the next moment he was stunned. Chapter 140. Dean's heart was hanging in the air. He carefully raised his right hand and gently touched the burns on his left hand. Suddenly, he felt no sensation. 09 small, say, net, how could this be? Dean's face was pale. His right hand was tightly covering several burns. Through his right hand, he could feel the extremely high temperature of his left hand. However, his left hand was touched by the burns, but he still felt no sensation. Impossible. Dean angrily raised his left hand and smashed it on the ground. Bang! A deep pit appeared on the ground. Dean was stunned. He raised his left hand and tried to make a fist. He saw that his fingers could move freely. When he wanted to make a fist, his left hand could make a fist. However, even if he made a fist, his left hand still couldn't feel it. He couldn't even feel the touch of his fingers on his palm. This feeling was very strange. He could clearly see the movement of his left hand and even control his left hand, but he couldn't feel his left hand being controlled by his brain. Dean gradually calmed down. He repeatedly looked at his left hand and his heart. Suddenly, he thought of the pit on the ground. He raised his left hand and grabbed the stone next to him. Bang! As soon as he grabbed it, the stone shattered in his palm. This stone was a concrete stone, and it had long been rotten. Originally, Dean wanted to smash it easily, but he absolutely didn't feel like now. He almost couldn't feel his own strength, but it was broken. Dean changed his right hand and continued to grab another stone. The touch was clear. He gently exerted force, and with a bang, the stone shattered again. Dean was suddenly relieved. It seemed that it wasn't because his left hand had lost feeling that he used too much force, but his strength had indeed improved. Dean took out the black bow from the storage next to him. This was the bow of Byrne, Linda's brother. He pinched the bowstring and just pulled it. With a bang, the bowstring suddenly broke and almost bounced on his face. Whether it's the weight of the grip or the feeling of pulling the bowstring, it's obviously light, as if it's made of straw. Dean grabbed both ends of the bow with both hands. With a little force, the black bow suddenly bent into a circle. My strength has increased, and it's more than doubled. Dean was a little excited, but when he saw the burns on his left hand, the joy in his heart suddenly disappeared. Although my strength has increased, but my left hand is equivalent to a waste. Although I can move, but the nerves inside should all be dead. I don't know if there will be other sequelae. Without the sense of touch, there will be a deviation in the grasp of power in the future. I can only rely on feeling. Thinking of this, he sighed in his heart. He continued to move his left hand, but he still couldn't feel it. He took out a dagger and heated it on the fire. He took out disinfectant and gauze from a first aid kit. After the dagger was heated, he opened his abdomen armor. He saw the hole in the side of his abdomen that was pierced by the tall youth's spear. The rotten flesh had rolled out. He gritted his teeth and used the dagger to cut off the rotten flesh on the outside of the wound. Hiss! The pain made him gasp. He clenched his teeth and endured it. He suddenly hoped that these wounds could be as numb as his left hand, so he wouldn't be in so much pain. After a moment, the rotten wound on the front and back of the abdomen was cut off and rebandaged. But the wound on the back could only be cut slowly. It was extremely inconvenient. Unfortunately, he was alone at the moment. Saving oneself in the wilderness was also a compulsory course for hunters. After a while, the rotten flesh on the front and back of the abdomen were cleaned and bandaged. Next was his thigh. The hunter gauntlet was broken, and there were a few teeth holes on it. There was a circle of teeth marks on his thigh, like a row of black holes. The wound was completely rotten. Dean once again burned the dagger and endured the pain to cut off the wound piece by piece. After 10 minutes, Dean finally finished bandaging all the wounds on his body. He was in pain and tired. I'll wait for the injury to heal a little, then I'll return to the giant wall. Dean thought. Although the outside of the giant wall was not suitable for healing, but it was also extremely dangerous to go back with such a body. However, before going back, he must go to the giant wall in advance and wait for the passage to open, so as not to miss it. Half a month later, the passage near the 9th district of the Melon Consortium was opened again. Dean thought that Peter, Mason, and others would come out, but he did not expect that it would be a team of hunters. Impressively, there was the female hunter that he had seen before. The female hunter should have been assigned to this new team. When she saw Dean, she was surprised and said, "It's you?" Dean's eyes narrowed. There was a trace of killing intent in his eyes. But suddenly he remembered that she, the swordsman, and the thief didn't help the captain to attack him. The killing intent in his heart converged a lot as he walked towards the passage. Hunter, the other 4 people in the team, were surprised to see Dean. They didn't expect to see a new hunter here. They were relieved when they saw the incomplete badge of the Melon Consortium on Dean's armor. One of the one-eyed youth asked the female hunter, "Do you know him?" The female hunter subconsciously nodded. Her palm couldn't help but touch the dagger on her leg. Dean's height made it easy for him to see the small movements of the other party. There was a trace of coldness in his eyes. He looked up at her. As long as she dared to pull out the dagger a little bit, he would immediately attack. The female hunter didn't hold the dagger to attack, but to defend. She was worried that Dean would hold a grudge against her and attack her. Although she knew that the other was just a newcomer, but after all, he was a real primary hunter. His physique wouldn't be inferior to hers. This point could be seen from the fact that he was able to successfully escape last time. So when she saw Dean approaching her, she couldn't help but feel nervous. Dean saw that she didn't have the intention to attack, so he didn't take the initiative to attack. He passed by them and entered the passage behind them. After Dean's figure disappeared, the one-eyed youth looked at the female hunter and said, "You seem to be afraid of him? He's just a newcomer. Is it necessary?" The female hunter was relieved when she saw Dean had left. She bitterly said, "We should find the leakers who broke into the 9th district as soon as possible." The others saw that she didn't want to say more, so they didn't ask anymore and went to the 9th district. Dean returned to the giant wall. According to the rules, he was once again sent to the Guardian. "I don't know if my left hand will be checked or not," Dean thought in his heart. He had absorbed too many cold crystals through his left hand. After all, these cold crystals were the crystallization of the undead's body. Now it seemed that a lot of cold crystals hadn't been digested and were frozen in his left hand. He didn't know if his left hand was the same as the undead's arm. However, he also knew that it was impossible to sneak into the commercial district. The border fortress of the commercial district was extremely strict. They almost didn't need a search when they came out, but when they went in, they had to check carefully. It could be said that it was the second checkpoint in addition to the Guardian. Moreover, this checkpoint was set up by the military. Hunters like them who wanted to enter the border fortress must get the qualified mark given by the Guardian. With this mark, they could pass through the border fortress. Dean entered the Guardian again. He was already familiar with the way. After washing his body with clean water, he put on clean clothes and sat in the cage to wait. The next day, someone came to give Dean a blood test. Dean was nervous. He stretched out his right hand to take the blood. The person didn't think much. He took out the blood from his right finger and dripped it into the bowl. There was already a drop of blood in the bowl. At the moment, as Dean's blood dripped into the bowl, the two quietly suspended in the bowl. Dean was relieved. He quietly waited for the 7 days to pass. After returning to the commercial district, I will leave the consortium's hunter establishment. I will be a trainee priest and then climb to the position of official priest. I might even be promoted to the position of deacon or bishop. At that time, I can give Jenny happiness. Dean quietly waited while planning the future. On the 4th day, the cage was opened again. Dean thought that it was other hunters. When he looked, he saw 7 or 8 people come in. 4 of them were apprentice knights of light. The other 4 were wearing strange uniforms. They came to Dean's cage. One of the middle-aged men shouted, "Are you Dean?" Dean was startled. He felt a trace of bad. "You are?" The middle-aged man snorted. "Now, on behalf of the magistrate, I will arrest you for theft. Come with me." "Theft?" Dean was confused. "You are mistaken. What did I steal? I am a hunter. I just came back from outside the giant wall, Dean couldn't help but say. The middle-aged man impatiently said, Don't be long-winded. If you have anything to say, go to prison. Prison? Dean was angry. There is no interrogation and investigation. What qualifications do you have to put me in prison? My words are the qualifications. The middle-aged man sneered. Dean looked at him and said, So, you don't have an arrest warrant? The middle-aged man's face sank. He said in a cold voice, Of course, but I am afraid that you will run away. Today, I will come to arrest you. After that, naturally there will be an arrest warrant. He waved his hand and said to the apprentice knight of light, Open the door and handcuff me. The apprentice knight of light nodded. He took out the key and opened the cage. Dean didn't think that he could order the apprentice knight of light. His face became more gloomy. Suddenly, his heart woke up. He couldn't help but have a strong, killing intent. He slowly stood up and stepped out of the cage. He looked up at the middle-aged man. You were called by the Melon Consortium. Do you want to impose a crime on me? The middle-aged man frowned and shouted to the person next to him, Handcuff him. Dean didn't resist, but raised his hand. He stared at the middle-aged man. Try to handcuff me. You dare to arrest an apprentice without an arrest warrant. Even if I am in prison, even if my crime has been confirmed by you, I still have the right to sue you as an apprentice for ignoring judicial procedures and abusing law enforcement. The middle-aged man raised his hand to stop the companion who was about to handcuff Dean. He looked down at the child who was almost the same age as his son. He didn't expect such a child to be able to maintain his composure in such a situation. He was shocked, but also felt a bit tricky. After a long silence, he said, Boy, you have guts. Do you think you are worthy to call me a boy? Dean sneered. The middle-aged man slightly frowned. He didn't want to argue with Dean. Wait for me to get the arrest warrant tomorrow. You will see. Then he waved his hand and beckoned a few people to leave. The apprentice knight of light and his companions looked at each other. They didn't expect that they would be forced back by Dean. They felt a bit vexed and could only go back dejectedly. After all, no one wanted to bear unnecessary trouble. Dean looked at them leaving, but his heart didn't have the slightest joy of winning the battle. Instead, his heart was incomparably cold, full of unspeakable anger and killing intent. At the same time, he quickly thought of a way out. If they say I stole, I have sufficient alibi. Even if they maliciously frame me, there is no evidence. Although they can perjure, but many people in the consortium know that I went outside the giant wall to perform a task. There is no way to hide it. Thinking of this, his heart was a little relieved. In the blink of an eye, another 3 days passed. Dean had just left the guardian's office when he saw a carriage and several people waiting outside. The middle-aged man was the leader of the group. Dean's heart couldn't help but sink. My 7A period hasn't ended, but he came to arrest me. Obviously, he didn't convict me at that time. Dean thought in his heart. In the past 3 days, he thought of some strange things. When he came for the first time, even if there was an arrest warrant, he didn't have the qualifications to take me away. After all, I can't leave the guardian's office even if I go to the prison. It means that he didn't want to take me to the prison, but wanted to kill me secretly. In this case, the consortium can even define my death as outside the giant wall so that the magistrate can't trace it. Dean looked at the middle-aged man who was sneering at him. His brows slightly wrinkled. Now that he dares to come over, he should have obtained an arrest warrant. But the magistrate hasn't interrogated me, so how can they give him an arrest warrant? Dean walked over and indifferently said, Don't show the smile of a henchman. It's disgusting. The middle-aged man was startled. His face turned gloomy. Boy, don't talk nonsense. Didn't you want an arrest warrant? I brought it for you. Then he took out a cross arrest warrant. Dean's heart sank, but his mouth said, You have the courage to forge an arrest warrant at will. The middle-aged man was stunned for a moment before he sneered. Brat, you will know whether it's fake or not when the time comes. However, I have already shown you my arrest warrant. If you dare to resist, I have the right to kill you on the spot. Dean certainly wouldn't resist. Even if he wasn't guilty, he would be directly included in the wanted list. He would be wanted by the whole city. There would be no place for him in the entire giant wall. Go. The middle-aged man opened the door of the cage and sneered at Dean. Chapter 141. Dean looked at him but didn't say anything. He slowly got into the carriage. The whole carriage was made of steel. It was extremely strong. Even with his current strength, it would be difficult to break it. The middle-aged man saw that Dean didn't resist. He curled his lips and locked the carriage. He jumped to the front and sat down. He said to the coachman, "Let's go. We'll send this kid over. He'll have a good time. He's so young, but he dares to hook up with a noble lady. He doesn't know what kind of trash he is. You want to reach the sky in a single bound? Ridiculous. It's been a long time since we've had fresh goods. Our hands are itching. This kind of soft skin and tender flesh is the most popular. Still a fledgling? Ha!" Both of them talked and laughed as they drove away. There were 4 knights escorting them on both sides of the carriage. Dean sat cross-legged in the carriage as he looked at the scenery along the way. After leaving the town, they entered the desolate radiation zone. They occasionally encountered beast attacks along the way, but were easily killed by the knights escorting them along the way. After passing through the border fortress's inspection, everyone entered the fortress and came to a remote wilderness. In the distance, there was a prison towering there. The carriage stopped in front of the prison. The middle-aged man opened the cage and said, "Come down." Dean jumped out of the carriage and said, "I want to appeal." "You can only groan now." The middle-aged man sneered. "Do you think you still have a chance to go to court? From the moment you arrived here, you have been a mute. No one will hear your words. When the ruling notice comes down, you will have no chance to turn things around. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for overestimating yourself. You should have been a hunter and earned well for the consortium. Why did you have to seduce a noble lady? You're courting death." Dean stared at him coldly. "Are you the warden?" The middle-aged man sneered. "Do you think that you will have a chance to see the warden with me here? It's easy to cover up a kid with no identity or background like you. Do you really think that you can be protected with your identity as a trainee magistrate?" Dean took a deep breath and clenched his fingers. "Thank you for your teachings." Then he punched him in the face. With a bang, the middle-aged man fell backward. His nose was broken and blood flowed out. Everyone was shocked by the sudden attack. No one expected that Dean would dare to sneak attack the warden in front of the prison gate. The middle-aged man fell to the ground, covering his face with one hand, desperately trying to stop the blood. He screamed, "Kill him!" Knights of the magistrate pulled out their weapons. Spears and swords of the magistrate rushed towards Dean. However, Dean didn't fight with them as they had imagined. Instead, he turned around and ran. As he ran, he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Murder! Murder!" His voice traveled into the prison, and in an instant, many people rushed over from the prison castle. "Stop!" The prison gate was pulled open, and 7 or 8 people ran out. The leader was a woman wearing glasses. She had a hot figure. She angrily shouted as she saw Dean and the 8 knights of the magistrate running away. The 8 knights of the magistrate quickly stopped and looked at each other. Dean immediately ran in front of the woman and said, "They have received black money to kill me. I want to appeal. Are you the warden?" The woman looked at him and slightly frowned. "I'm the secretary of the warden. If you want to appeal, I can help you apply. But I don't know if the higher-ups will approve it or not." Dean was overjoyed. "Thank you. Thank you." The middle-aged man covered his nose and came over. His face was ugly as he looked at Dean. His eyes were full of killing intent and anger. He said to the woman, "Secretary Leah, this kid was the first to complain. He obviously wanted to sneak attack me to escape. Attacking the warden is a serious crime. He should be executed immediately." The woman's face sank. "Look at your embarrassing appearance. You were beaten by a child. It's a disgrace. Also, you better pay attention to your words. We are only responsible for the detention of prisoners. We don't have the right to execute them. Don't talk nonsense and implicate the entire prison." The middle-aged man's face changed as he bowed his head. "Yes." The woman turned to Dean and said in a cold voice, "You better behave after entering the prison. No matter what the reason is, I won't let you off lightly." Dean immediately nodded. His attitude was very sincere. The woman looked at the middle-aged man. Send him in, but you don't need to be responsible for supervising him. I will arrange someone else to come over. She turned and left. After she left, the middle-aged man turned his head and looked at Dean fiercely. He lowered his voice and said, "Little devil, don't think that your life can be safe. As long as I am here, I will absolutely make you wish you were dead." Dean said in a cold voice, still not leading the way. The middle-aged man clenched his fists in anger, but gritted his teeth and continued to lead the way. In a luxurious office on the top floor of the prison. Oh, this kid turned out to be a hunter. In front of the desk, a bald man was sitting on a chair. He took the information from Leah's secretary and scanned it, his eyebrows slightly raised. A hunter from the Melon Consortium has committed the crime of theft? Interesting. Moreover, the dog raised by the Melon Consortium has personally delivered it to me. This is the first time I've seen a consortium wanting to cut down their own money tree. You should immediately talk to the Melon Consortium about this matter and see their reaction. Leah's secretary was puzzled. What about the appeal? If the Melon Consortium wants to kill him, then we will sell them face and help them cover it up. Of course, the fees can't be reduced. This is free money. How can we not earn it? The bald, middle-aged man smiled and said, "Moreover, this matter is also beneficial to our consortium." I know. Leah's secretary nodded. Dean sat in an independent prison cell, quietly waiting. I don't know if the Melon Consortium will bribe the warden after they get the news. He was worried. I have to think of other ways to get out. As long as I can get the opportunity to appeal, then I will have the opportunity to prove that I am wronged. Unfortunately, no one can bail me out, even if they have a little background. But if they have a little background, then they will collapse under the pressure of the Melon Consortium. I don't know if Aunt Jura will be implicated by me. Damn! His heart was sullen, angry, and a trace of fear. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. For the past 3 days, no one had brought him food or water. He also understood that although there was a new person in charge of supervising him, that person had most likely been bribed by the middle-aged man. As for him, he was just a prisoner. Perhaps it would only take a silver coin for someone to mercilessly hurt another stranger. However, the most worrying thing in his heart was that there was no movement outside for 3 days. There should be no hope to appeal. Dean looked at the glimmer of light outside the window. There was some sadness in his heart, but there was more despair and anger, as well as a strong, killing intent. I can only escape from here. Otherwise, I will be trapped here and suffer humiliation. If I escape from here, I will live in the darkness for the rest of my life. In that case, I will never see Aunt Jura, Macon, and the others, and I won't be able to see her. Dean was sad, but his instinctive desire to survive inspired his determination to live. He began to seriously think about ways to escape from the prison. In the blink of an eye, 2 days passed. On this day, the cage suddenly opened. Dean, who was leaning against the wall to sleep, slightly opened his eyes and thought, the opportunity has come. His heart was filled with killing intent, but suddenly a familiar smell floated into his nose, making him slightly startled. Dean! At this moment, an incredible voice came, panicked. You! How did you become like this? Dean was shocked when he heard the voice. He couldn't help but stare at the source of the voice. He saw Jenny in a white dress standing in front of the dim cage. Her white fingers were grasping the cage, forming a sharp contrast with the dark and thick steel column. Dean's eyes widened. He almost suspected that he was too hungry. His nose and eyes were hallucinating. He couldn't help but say, Jenny? How did you come here? My father sent me here. Did they abuse you? Jenny's eyes were red. Dean hurriedly climbed up and grabbed her hand. He said excitedly, Are you okay? Your father didn't hurt you? Jenny was startled. She immediately broke away from his hand and stepped back. She rubbed the tears in her eyes and bit her lower lip. Don't say that about my father. He won't hurt me. I'm here to ask you, why? Why do you want to steal? Dean was shocked. He felt that the blood that had just boiled suddenly became cold again. Moreover, it was cold to the bottom of his heart, and there was a bone-piercing pain. He thought bitterly in his heart. Yes, You are your father's precious daughter. He will naturally not hurt you. Why should I worry?" He looked at the pure white girl and said bitterly, "Do you also think I will steal?" Jenny gritted her teeth. "The evidence is conclusive. I found a Dragon Mountain ruby from the Milan family in your safe. It is one of the 3 treasures of the Milan family. There is no second one in the world. Why did you do this?" Dean's body trembled as he clenched the iron column of the cage. "If I say that I don't know the Milan family and have never seen the ruby, will you believe me? Why are you lying to me?" Jenny's eyes were full of tears. "I have inquired everywhere. I know the truth of the matter. Why do you still want to lie to me?" Dean was full of bitterness. "I have never lied to you. All of this was done by your father in order to separate us. He deliberately framed me. Why don't you want to believe me? Don't you know my character after a year of getting along with me?" Jenny squatted down in pain and said, "At first, I thought so too, but I asked the people from the Milan family. 2 months ago, the Milan family's young lady invited you to visit their house. After that, their Longshan ruby was lost. At that time, I still thought that it was impossible for you to do such a thing. Even if I found the Dragon Mountain ruby in your safe, I still believe that someone framed you. But Deacon Huey personally accepted the case. After a few weeks of investigation, he verified that it was indeed you who stole it." Dean was startled. He suddenly understood. No wonder they didn't interrogate him, but issued an arrest order. It turned out that Deacon-level Deacon had accepted the case and investigated it clearly. However, he knew very well that he had never seen Miss Milan at all. All of this was false. It was all a false accusation. The Deacon should have been bought by your father. Dean gloomily said. Jenny angrily raised her head. "Don't talk about my father again." Dean's tears almost fell. He said bitterly, "Do you believe in your father so much?" Jenny slightly gritted her teeth and said, "It's not that I believe you, but you really did it. You may not understand that although our Bourong family is very big, but it's impossible to bribe a deacon of the magistrate. The deacon is very noble and pure. It's impossible for him to be bewitched by money. Moreover, this deacon has nothing to do with our family, so he has no reason to slander you." Dean bitterly said, "No one can't be tempted by money. Even the deacon of the magistrate is no exception. Even the Knights of Light of the Holy Church are no exception." Jenny looked up at him and suddenly wiped away her tears. Her expression gradually calmed down as she said, "Because you are a thief. You love money, so you think that everyone is the same. The books say that in the eyes of the despicable, everyone is despicable. In the eyes of the noble, everyone is noble." Dean clenched the iron pillar. "If you no longer believe me, then why did you come here?" Jenny's body trembled and her eyes reddened. "I just want you to admit it. As long as you admit it, I don't care about all this. I can still be with you. I can forgive you for your crimes. But you still refuse to repent. You even try to frame my father and slander the clergy to cover up your crimes. I'm really disappointed in you." "Disappointed?" Dean smiled, but tears fell down from his eyes. "You would rather believe an outsider, a deacon of the magistrate, than me. You are right. I am guilty. My sin is that I am too stupid and naive. I thought that we can break the shackles of love between nobles and civilians. My sin is that I overestimated my capabilities. I thought that you would follow me to the ends of the earth. However, birds and fishes, even if they love each other, can't be together." Suddenly, the door of the cage was pushed open. A middle-aged man stepped in. He had an extraordinary temperament and was full of majesty. He said to Jenny, "Child, it's time to go back." Dean raised his head and looked at the man. His eyes were full of resentment. "If you want to break us up, then why not do it openly? You can ask me for a goal. If I can't do it, then I will voluntarily leave." "Why? Why do you use such despicable means?" "Enough." Jenny interrupted Dean. She looked at him. "Why don't you admit your mistake? Until now, you are still falsely accusing my father. If a person is innocent, then who can wrongly accuse you? Is the entire consortium wrongly accusing you? I have asked. Your magic mark ability is the sense of smell, right?" Dean looked at her in a daze. "You knew my identity the first time we met, right? You used your sense of smell to deliberately arrange a chance encounter. Like in the bardic stories, You created a chance encounter scene in order to get close to me, right? You sent me back on a rainy night. Later, you accompanied me to participate in the magistrate exam. Then, you came again and again to accompany me. Tears rolled down from Jenny's eyes. Even if I know all these, I still like you so much. I like the tone of your voice. I like your maturity. I know that these can't be faked. But why don't you admit your mistake? Why do you want to be a thief? Dean heard her words. He felt as if his heart was stabbed by a dagger again and again. The pain was suffocating. He suddenly understood that when a person doesn't trust you, all your explanations are lies. All the sincerity is hypocrisy. Even if you do everything, you can't get unconditional trust just once. Is this love? He looked at her and suddenly wanted to laugh. For you, I am willing to give up everything, even my own ideals. For you, I even gave up myself, willing to live the life you like. Because of your father's calculation, I almost lost my life in this hunt. However, all of this did not exchange for a good end. Instead, he became a despicable person, a dirty thief. He felt ridiculous. How foolish he was. He should have known that there would not be a good end. It was ridiculous that he held hope, humble and pitiful hope. He thought that as long as he treated her sincerely, he could overcome all difficulties. Naivety in exchange for calculation. His good intentions were met with framing. He looked up and laughed. He laughed so hard that he coughed. The middle-aged man looked at Dean indifferently and said to Jenny, "Let's go." Jenny looked at the crazy Dean and hesitantly asked the middle-aged man, "Father, will he be all right?" Middle-aged man smiled. "It's just a theft. Although the value of the things he stole is enough to sentence him to 200 years in prison. But I have talked to the Milan family, and they will reduce his sentence. We will use our family's network to help reduce his sentence. At most, he will be released after 3 to 5 years. Although this method is a bit illegal, but I hope he is on his own." Jenny was relieved. She took a deep look at Dudian. Her eyes were red again. She held back her tears and turned away. Dean looked at her back. He instinctively wanted to reach out to stop her, but he put down his hand. He suddenly understood that once something was lost, it would be difficult to get it back. He was silent as he stood in the cage. Like a cold and hard stone, it stood still and silent. 2 days later, another person came from outside. It was the middle-aged man who was previously injured by Dean. His nose was bandaged with gauze. When he pushed the door and came in, he saw Dean standing straight like a corpse, motionless. He was shocked, but then he found that Dean was not hanging. He was relieved and said coldly, "Stop pretending to be mysterious. Brat, wake up." Dean didn't respond as if he didn't hear anything. Middle-aged man sneered and took out a sheepskin scroll. "This is the notice from the magistrate. Your verdict has come out. Death sentence is suspended. You will be sent to Thornflower Prison. The verdict will be executed after 5 years." Dean, who had been standing still for 2 days, moved slightly and slowly raised his head. His eyes slowly swept over the parchment in the middle-aged man's hand, and then moved to the middle-aged man's face. His lips revealed a smile. Seeing this smile, the smile on the middle-aged man's face suddenly disappeared, and he felt his hair stand on end. Sylvia's giant wall calendar year, 305, Black Snow Season. Dean, who was only 13 years old, was escorted to the number 1 prison of the outer wall, Thornflower Prison. He became the youngest prisoner in the last 50 years of Thornflower Prison. Chapter 142. Thornflower Prison, also known as Sylvia's first prison. The fame of the first prison even overshadowed some of the ancient aristocrats whose businesses were spread throughout the 3 regions. However, there were very few people who knew the location of the prison except for the relevant personnel. At the moment, a huge steel carriage was slowly moving. The arm-thick steel cage was covered with a piece of black cloth. It was tied with a rope to prevent it from being lifted by the wind. There were 12 knights of the magistrate who were responsible for escorting the prisoners. The magistrate's knights were extremely strong. Even the knights of light would find it difficult to match them. The combat power of these 12 knights was equivalent to thousands of guards. At the moment, the carriage stopped. The black cloth outside the cage was untied, revealing the figure inside. It was Dean, who was sitting cross-legged. He had been hungry for 7 days in the prison. His hair was messy and his skin was dull. His hands and feet were shackled with thick metal chains to restrict his movements. "Come down," one of the knights of the magistrate shouted. Dean slowly raised his head and looked around the carriage. His eyes flashed. He saw that the Thornflower prison was in the middle of a lake. In addition to the aisle of the carriage, there was lake water on both sides. There were some huge swimming shadows in the lake. "What are you looking at? Come down," the young knight of the magistrate shouted. Dean slowly stood up, patted the dust on his body, and jumped out of the carriage. "Go!" Another knight of the magistrate pressed his shoulder and shouted. Dean looked at him indifferently. "I will go by myself." The knight of the magistrate snorted. "Then go quickly. I don't want to dirty my hands." Dean stepped on the artificial aisle and walked towards a huge black castle-like prison in front of him. The metal chains on his ankles dragged on the ground, and the bells were ringing. Splash! Waves suddenly surged out of the lake beside the passageway. It was a 7 to 8 meter long crocodile-like monster. It surged out of the water with a 2 meter long, odd-looking fish in its mouth. After it leaped out of the water, it sank back down, splashing the lake water high up to the edge of the passageway. Dean looked at it and narrowed his eyes. "It should be a monster. Don't look at it. It's just a small one." A knight sneered. Dean silently retracted his gaze and continued to move forward. After a while, the group of people arrived at the prison at the end of the corridor. The prison was built in the middle of the lake and was about 2 stories high. Outside the prison was a garden. At this moment, there were actually gardeners watering the garden. "Go in. The prison is below," said one of the knights. Following the stone path in the garden, everyone entered the gate of the castle prison. The lobby was luxurious and spacious. 7 or 8 prison guards in uniform sat in the lobby, eating snacks, drinking coffee, and chatting with each other. If it were not for their uniforms and the medals on their shoulders, most people would think that this was a high-end restaurant in the commercial district. The people in the lobby looked at them after Dean and the 12 knights came in. There was a playful smile on their faces. "It's the first time I've seen such a small one. Soft skin and tender flesh, this is my type. Another new plaything. The last one was too weak. It died after a few tries. Let's investigate whether it has any background. Don't do anything unnecessary. What kind of background can a person sent to us have?" Whispers rose one after another in the lobby. But Dean's hearing was extraordinary. He could hear everything clearly. His eyes became colder as he slowly clenched his fists. "Take him away. Don't affect my appetite. It stinks," one of the young jailers who was sitting near the door said in a disgusted tone. A knight of the magistrate looked at Dean. "Follow me." He turned and walked towards a small door next to the lobby. Behind the small door was a dimly lit corridor leading to the basement. The basement level was a spacious torture chamber. The walls were covered with torture tools, and there were sharp barbed iron bars on a horizontal plank. They were stained with blood, and brown flesh could even be seen on the barbed iron bars. Dean's face was gloomy. At this time, a guard sitting behind the counter in the basement saw Dean and others. He immediately stood up and said in surprise, "Newcomers? So small?" A knight of the magistrate said to him, "We have delivered the person. We will hand him over to you. This is his information." After that, he handed a document to the young jailer. The young jailer took a look and was surprised. "Theft? Is there a mistake? The crime of theft is here?" He looked at the bottom of the document and suddenly realized, so, poor little guy. There was no sympathy on his face as he said this. He put the document on the counter and said to Dean, "Little guy, take off your clothes." Dean slightly frowned. He thought for a moment, but took off his clothes. "Well, good. I haven't eaten today, so I don't have to clean you up." The young jailer picked up a bucket of water and poured it on Dean's head. The cold water drenched him from head to toe. His hair stuck to his face. Dean lowered his head and slightly clenched his fists. The young jailer glanced at Dean's fists and sneered. "Little bastard, do you want to retaliate against me? Your bones are hard, right? You're all very hard when you've just arrived. Now squat down and pry open your dirty clothes. Let me see if there's anything hidden inside." Dean stared at him, clenching his fists. "Go, kid." The knight behind seemed to know the inside story. There was a trace of regret in his eyes as he looked at Dean. "Although you're sentenced to death, but there is basically no room for a comeback. It is best not to provoke these twisted devils. No one will know, even if they torture you to death. So it is better to be obedient." When the young jailer heard this, a smile appeared on his face as he said, "You can't say that about us. We are here to help you imprison the devil. We are all holy angels." The knight frowned and coldly snorted. The young jailer smiled and said, "When you commit a crime in the future and are assigned to this place, I will also take good care of you." "I hope so." The knight sneered. The young jailer took back his eyes and looked at Dean. His face sank. "Boy, don't you understand what I said?" He pulled out a steel pipe and smashed it towards Dean's shoulder. Bang! The steel pipe hit Dean's shoulder. Dean looked up and stared at the young jailer like a beast. He tried to restrain himself from punching the young jailer. Puff! The punch landed on the young jailer's chest. In an instant, a few crisp sounds could be heard, like the sound of bones breaking. The young jailer's body flew backward and hit a horizontal torture device behind him, spitting out a mouthful of blood. "Stop! Stop!" The knights in the back saw him and hurried to pull him from behind. Dean roared and waved his hands. The two knights who were the first to run over-grabbed his hands and were thrown forward. They were horrified when they got up. Smelly Boy, the leader of the knights' face was cold. He came up and kicked Dean. The speed and strength of the kick was extremely fast. Dean was ready to dodge, but he couldn't react. He was kicked in the side of the abdomen and fell to the ground. The other knights immediately rushed up and pressed Dean to the ground. Dean's eyes were red as he stared at the knight who had kicked him. He struggled, but his hands and feet were pressed down by a knight. His neck was tightly clasped by two knights. He could hardly breathe, let alone break free. Although these knights were not his opponents in a one-on-one fight, but at the moment they surrounded him like a swarm of bees. It was still difficult for him to match them. Moreover, there was also the leader of the Knights of the Magistrate, who was stronger than an intermediate hunter. At this time, one of the magistrate paladins came to the young jailer, stopped the bleeding, and helped him to stand up. The young jailer was sweating in pain. He looked at Dean, who was pressed to the ground, and roared, "Smelly bastard, I'm going to peel your skin." His emotions were so intense that it affected the injury on his chest. He suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. His neck crooked, and he fainted. The knight who supported him frowned. He looked at the knight leader. "What should we do?" "Send him to the hospital and inform the others," the knight leader said. The knight immediately helped the young jailer to the stairs. After a moment, 4 or 5 young jailers came down from the stairs. They looked at Dean, who was pressed to the ground by 6 knights. They didn't expect that the newly transferred little guy would have such great strength. So many knights were needed to subdue him. "Take him to the cell. It's getting late. We have to go back," the knight leader said to them. The young jailers looked at each other and immediately stepped forward. They found the chains and said to the 6 knights, "Everyone, help me lock the little devil to the chains." The 6 knights couldn't help but look at the leader. The leader glanced at the place that the young jailer said. It was a cross. He slightly frowned but nodded. The 6 knights immediately locked Dean's hands, feet, and head. They firmly locked him and moved him to the cross. His hands were fastened to the iron shackles on both sides of the cross. His chest was also locked with steel hoops. Dean's height was smaller than an adult, so his feet were locked off the ground. Dean struggled hard, but the 6 knights locked his hands and feet. They were skilled at the joints, so he couldn't exert his full strength. He could only watch helplessly as he was locked on the rack. "Let's go." The knight leader seemed to know what was going to happen next. He frowned and turned to leave. The other knights saw the jailer's appearance. There was a bit of disgust in their eyes. They followed him up the stairs. They only heard a light bang sound as the small door was closed. The 5 jailers looked at Dean's struggling appearance. One of them laughed. "Don't struggle, little devil. We will serve you well." They pulled up the whip on the wall. The whip was full of small, sharp nails. They shook it in front of Dean's eyes, as if showing off a delicious dish. Dean struggled for a moment. He felt that the place where the cross was tied to was not showing any signs of loosening. He suddenly stopped struggling and used his strength to protect the surface of his body. "I want to live. Live," he kept saying in his heart. With a puff, the whip in the jailer's hand lashed out. The iron on the whip definitely scratched his body, and the sharp pain immediately made him clench his teeth. "Scream, scream," the jailer said excitedly as he whipped. Dean lowered his head and clenched his teeth. The other 4 jailers laughed. "I like such a hard bone. Pay attention. Don't kill him. Let's pierce the nails first." "All right." One of them took out 2 finger-long nails from the box onto the torture cabinet. Behind the nails was a huge nail cap. The nails were covered with dust. He picked it up and blew it. Perhaps it was too long. There was a lot of rust on the nails. The man didn't care. He picked up a hammer from the cabinet and walked toward Dean. "It's been a long time since someone came here. The nails are rusty." One of them picked up a nail and shook his head. "Come on, hold him down," the youth with the hammer said. The others immediately held Dean down. The youth with the hammer pointed the end of the nail at a few inches below Dean's shoulder blade. He lifted the hammer and slammed it behind the nail. Puff! The sharp steel nail penetrated into Dean's flesh. "What is pain?" Dean, who had experienced many injuries outside the giant wall, almost fainted from the pain. It was as if his soul was trembling. Bang! The youth lifted the hammer and smashed it again. Dean couldn't help but scream out loud. Several jailers heard Dean's screams, and the smile on their faces became more and more intense. For a time, the whole torture room was filled with screams and the sound of the hammer. After a moment, 2 nails were nailed a few inches below Dean's shoulder blades. In this severe pain, Dean was dying. He suddenly found that in the face of pain, he couldn't think of anything in his mind. He couldn't gather any thoughts. Sadness, disappointment, and so on were all gone. There was only the feeling of pain. Several jailers obviously didn't stop there. They picked up the torture instruments on the table next to them and called them on Dean's body. A few hours later, several people carried Dean, who was dripping with blood and had no strength like a corpse, to the side of the corridor leading to the underground. After entering the corridor, they came to the floor below the corridor. The light here was dim. There were dim yellow oil lamps on the wall. The inside was extremely spacious. There was a steel cage as thick as an arm. There were figures sitting in the darkness. "Hey, a newcomer. Poor little guy. The smell of blood is so fragrant, so small. Gee, look at this delicate skin and tender flesh. Hey, my lord, send this little guy to our cell." Excited voices came from the cages on both sides. Some people whistled. Dean's consciousness was blurred, so he couldn't hear what they said. But when he passed by one of the cages, a voice came to the iron pillar next to the cage and smiled at him. "Welcome to our happy little family." Then, Dean felt that he was thrown on a cold, hard ground. His cheek was on the ground. A fishy smell came from the ground, as if someone had urinated here. He had always been a clean freak, so he instinctively wanted to raise his head. But if he moved his body a little, his whole body would be in unspeakable pain. Behind him, there was a click sound of the cage being locked. Several jailers laughed and left. Dean was like a fish that had jumped ashore, gasping hard. Suddenly, he felt a big hand lift his collar, and then his whole body was light. In front of his blurred vision, there was a fat face with a blind eye and yellow teeth. The fat face grinned at him. "Little devil, you have committed a crime at such a young age, but you have been locked up here. You are amazing." Dean gasped. "Put me down." "What did you say?" "Speak louder." The fat face deliberately put his ear close to Dean's. Dean gasped but didn't speak again. The fat face grinned, put Dean on the straw mat next to him, then stood up and untied his pants in front of Dean. Dean reluctantly opened his eyes, looked at the lower part of the body exposed in front of him, and suddenly realized what the fat man wanted to do. His muddy brain suddenly sobered up, but his whole body was still in pain, especially the 2 steel nails on his shoulders. Moving his arms a little bit made him feel like dying. The fat middle-aged man looked back and said, "When I finish enjoying, it will be your turn." Dean gasped and stared at him. "If you dare to put this thing in my mouth, I promise you will lose it." The fat middle-aged man's face was cold. "If you dare to bite, I will instantly smash your head." Dean stared at him. Believe me, when people are in pain, their first reaction is to clench their teeth. Chapter 143. Hearing Dean's words, Fatty was slightly stifled. Looking at the boy who was dying but still stubborn, he suddenly sneered. "Wait until I break your teeth, so that you can only eat porridge. Let's see how you bite." Dean was startled, and his face suddenly changed. "What are you doing? Come and hold him down." Fatty turned back and roared. In the darkness of the cage behind him, several figures of different heights came out and sneered. "This little devil is strong. It should be very exciting to play with him. Struggle, little brat. I'll make you scream with joy later." Several people laughed and said, while moving forward, looking at Dean, who was forced to stick close to the cage and laugh with bad intentions. There was a burst of laughter from the other cages next to them. Some people in the cage shouted loudly, "Fat pig, don't play too much. We still want to play. It's rare to see such a soft skin and tender flesh come in. Damn, this fat pig is lucky. Unexpectedly throw him into this fat pig's cell. If I knew there were new people coming in, I would have killed one or two to make room." Dean looked at the approaching figures and smelled the stench of urine and feces. He felt nauseous in his heart. He clenched his teeth and struggled to stand up slowly. Just this small movement was so painful that his whole body almost cramped. He wished he could pass out. However, the surrounding laughter, as well as the nearing lascivious laughter, caused his heart to be filled with fear, anger, and a deep sense of helplessness and sorrow. He clenched his fists, and like a wounded beast, he growled, "Don't come any closer." The youth's pale roar was met with more and more laughter. He tightly stuck to the cage. His heart only wanted to escape from here, but there was no way back behind him. What is despair? When he faced a few meters tall monster, he still held a trace of desire to survive. But at this moment, there was a pain in the bone marrow of despair. At this time, those figures stood in front of him, surrounded him, and reached out to grab his arms and shoulders with a lewd smile. Seeing such a move, Dean was like a frightened beast. He roared angrily and raised his fist to smash. But as soon as he raised his arm, the handcuff chain made a jingling sound, affecting the other arm. From his shoulder blade to the other arm, there was a burst of severe pain, almost making him faint. At the same time, there was a sound of fist hitting flesh. A thin figure who was grabbing his arm was hit in the chest by Dean's fist. He took a few steps back and almost fell down. He covered his chest and kept rubbing it to relieve the pain. At the same time, he gasped in horror. This sudden counterattack caused the others to be stunned for a moment. The other noisy cells also quieted down for a moment, and then a burst of laughter came. "This little brat is pretty strong. You still have the strength to fight back, even with such injuries." TSK. Fat pig, your subordinates are too weak. They were actually beaten back by a little brat. Did you squeeze them dry too much? Haha. All the good stuff is in this fat pig's mouth. Hearing the ridicule of the other cells, fat middle-aged man and the figures surrounding Dean all looked ugly. Mother f asterisk her, take off his pants for me. I want to f asterisk CK him to death. The obese middle-aged man said angrily. The others immediately stepped forward. Dean gasped and looked at the few people approaching again. He roared and waved his fists randomly. Although the fists were not big, they were waved in the wind. The people next to him did not dare to get close for a while. One of them boldly tried to catch Dean's fist, but as soon as he touched it, he was shocked to find that the strength of the small fist was beyond his imagination. His arm was numb, and he hurriedly retreated. Fat middle-aged man saw that several of his subordinates did not dare to get close. He scolded and stepped forward to see the opportunity. He kicked the gap in Dean's chest. Bang! Dean's body hit the cage behind him, making a muffled sound. Fat middle-aged man's strength was great. He stepped forward and kicked Dean's chest, shouting, "Stubborn! Stubborn!" In vain, he screamed in pain. He saw Dean suddenly wrapped his foot and bit his thigh like a vicious dog. Fat middle-aged man hurriedly swung his foot, but when he swung, Dean's teeth pulled the flesh of his thigh, tearing it more painful. In panic and anger, he hurriedly raised his fist and hit Dean's head. Bang! Dean's head was hit by the fist. His eyes turned black, and he almost fainted. But at this moment, there was no other thought in his mind. There was only one thought: live, never let go. Bang! Bang! Fat middle-aged punched again and again, but Dean still bit Dean and didn't loosen his grip. Help me pull him away. Fat middle-aged man was in pain and cold sweat. He roared at the people next to him. Several people reacted and hurried forward to pull Dean's hands and feet. One of them was quick-witted. He lifted his foot and kicked the nail on Dean's back. Dean couldn't help but cry out in pain due to the sharp pain. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Fatty hurriedly withdrew his foot. He saw that the flesh on his thigh was engraved with teeth marks. It was like a dumpling almost falling off from his thigh, leaving only a little bit of flesh stuck to his thigh. He roared in pain and retreated to the straw mat next to him. He roared to several of his subordinates. Beat him hard, beat him to death. Hearing this, several of his subordinates did not dare to neglect and immediately punched and kicked Dean. Dean felt like he was thrown into a blender. A steady stream of force hit his body as if to crush him. The pain was imposed on his body, making him feel like he was better off dead than alive. The sharp pain seemed to shatter all his consciousness, his persistence, his beliefs, and even his personality. Perhaps if he bowed his head, he would no longer feel pain. Don't resist, you will die. There seemed to be a voice constantly telling him. He didn't know how much time had passed. As if he was finally tired of it, he felt that he was thrown to the ground. The punches and kicks that constantly hit his body were all withdrawn. At this moment, he suddenly felt that the world seemed to calm down. His heart was relieved. He only hoped that he could lie down like this. However, the world was connected. If a person fell down, he would meet another person who would step on him again. In a daze, he felt his body being lifted up by someone. Two coarse hands grabbed his waist, as if they were carrying a weak sandbag. His body also bent down from the waist, as if he was bending over and lowering his head. His muddled thoughts were suddenly awakened. Although he did not look, he realized what kind of posture this was. Don't resist, it's too painful. There seemed to be a voice persuading him. Bear it? He suddenly thought that if he could bear such a thing, he could even abandon himself. Why can't he bear this pain? These thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. Faces flashed through his mind. Intense hatred and unwillingness suddenly blocked his chest. He roared hysterically, twisted his body, raised his left hand, and waved it. Bang! The fist swept the side of the figure's abdomen. The figure groaned, loosened his hand, and took a few steps back. Dean also fell to the ground, but he climbed up again. He clenched his fists and knelt on the ground, roaring at the sky. Ah, ah, ah. The roar reverberated throughout the entire cage, resounding through the entire cell. The person who was hit in the abdomen was about to rush up, but heard the soul-shaking roar of the teenager. He could not help but be startled. It was like a battle between beasts, roaring at each other to scare each other. He was frightened. The laughter of other cells was instantly overshadowed by the roar. Everyone looked at the young and thin figure and could not help but put away the contempt in the bottom of their hearts. For a time, they were speechless. The cell was silent. Only the roar echoed. Chapter 144. After a moment, the fat middle-aged man who was next to him reacted and shouted, "Waste! Go and cripple him. Let's see how he will fight back." "Boss!" The man who was covering his abdomen hesitated. "This kid's strength is too big. He doesn't look like an ordinary civilian. How about we starve him for a few days and then cripple him?" Fat middle-aged man was so angry that he rolled his eyes. Waste! Waste! Although he was cursing, he didn't force the others to besiege Dean. The latter's resistance really surprised him. Generally, people who had been pierced by steel nails, no matter how rebellious they were before, would become like a dead dog. They wouldn't be able to resist. But this kid was very strange. He was obviously lying on the ground and didn't have the strength to stand up. But the result was that his resistance was crazier and fiercer than the others. Moreover, he had tasted Dean's strength. He couldn't help but think that if it wasn't for the steel nails, he wouldn't be the kid's opponent in a head-on fight. Don't let him rest. This kid is most likely a hunter or a knight. Although fat middle-aged man's face was fierce, but his mind was very sharp. Give me 24/7 turns to attack him. Don't let him close his eyes. I don't believe that I can't beat him. A newcomer wants to make waves? Bah! Fat pig, stop! A voice came from the cell next to him. A burly youth said in a low voice, "This kid has good potential. I want him." Fat middle-aged man's face sank. "Scar, it's not that I don't want to give you face, but I have already offended this kid. If I let him live a good life in the future, then I won't have a good life. I must cripple him. I promise you that he won't provoke you in the future." The burly youth frowned. Fat middle-aged man sneered. "When his injury is healed, then he will come to me for revenge. You may not be able to stop him. There is no room for discussion. You don't have to say it again. I don't want to fall out with you." The burly youth's face was gloomy. He deeply looked at him, but didn't say anything. "What are you waiting for? I said don't give him time to breathe." Fat middle-aged man turned back and shouted. These people were hesitant, but they still stepped forward to intimidate Dean, making him tense up. Dean gasped and looked at the figures that were constantly shaking in front of him. The previous torture on the rack and a massive loss of blood made his eyes blurred. He raised his hand to make an attack posture while restoring his physical strength. Among them, a skinny youth was more clever. He saw that Dean was just an empty frame. After a few deliberate feints, he suddenly kicked out. Dean was caught off guard. He was kicked in the arm and fell to the ground. When the others saw this, they grew bolder and continued to feign attacks. Occasionally, they would launch a sneak attack. Dean's body was soon covered with scars. The skinny youth feinted back and forth a few times, but once again attacked and kicked Dudian's neck. Dean, who had long given up resistance, raised his arm in vain and tightly hugged his foot. His face was ferocious as he raised his other arm and smashed it on his knee. "Kacha!" The sound of bones breaking echoed. At the same time, the skinny youth's mouth issued a pig-like scream, howling in pain. When the others saw this, they hurriedly stepped forward and kicked Dean, forcing him to let go of his hand. Dean didn't resist. He loosened his hand and leaned against the cage behind him. He felt the pain on both sides of his shoulder blades, making his nerves twitch. But compared with before, he was barely able to bear it. It was like the human instinct was gradually adapting. The skinny young man retreated with the help of the others. He sat on a straw mat on the ground and cried out in pain. The leg he had kicked out was protruding in the opposite direction. The blood vessels and nerves inside were obviously damaged. Fat middle-aged man's face changed. He looked at Dean coldly and said, "Good boy, you are tenacious." Dean stared at him and didn't speak. The others immediately helped the skinny youth to deal with his leg injury and adjust his bones. For a while, no one paid attention to Dean. The people in other cells knew that the entertainment was over. They were a bit bored. Boring. Fat pig is too garbage. He can't even deal with a little kid. Fat pig, if you don't kill the little kid, then you'll be the one to die. He came to our Thornflower prison at such a young age. He is definitely an evil embryo. Fat middle-aged man didn't think that the new kid would be so difficult to deal with. But he didn't rush to act and continued to wait. A few hours later, 2 jailers opened the door and put down a wooden plank from the stairs. They carried a cart and rolled down the plank to the corridor. One of the jailers shouted, "Trash, it's time to eat." The laughter and chatter in the cells suddenly quieted down. Another jailer picked up the food on the table and threw it into each cell. All of them were pieces of dark bread. "Sir, we seem to be missing one," someone in one of the cells said. 2 jailers picked up the dark bread and casually threw it away. One of them bent down and said, "Missing one? Give me the one in your hand." The jailer seemed to realize something and shook his head. "It's a lot. I told you to give it to me. Did you hear me? Stupid pig." The jailer roared. The jailer's face turned ugly, but he still handed the bread to the jailer. The jailer picked up the bread and spat 2 mouthfuls of saliva on it. He threw it on the ground outside the cell. He lifted his toes and stepped on it. He twisted back and forth and flattened the bread. He sneered, "Garbage. If you want to eat, then pick it up." Then he went back to the cart and continued to distribute the dark bread to the other cells in the corridor. After a moment, the cart arrived in front of Dean's cell. One of the jailers was one of the 5 jailers. He saw Dean leaning against the cage. He couldn't help but laugh. "Little kid, are you used to living here? Did this fat pig make you happy?" His tone was relaxed, as if he was greeting an old acquaintance. Dean lowered his head and didn't make sound. The other jailer looked at Dean and laughed. "I heard that there's a new kid who came today. He crippled a jailer, so he can't go to work. Is it that little guy?" The former jailer laughed. "Yes, it's Lawrence's fault. He is too stupid. He doesn't know how to nail him first and then torture him. Ha! You'll have to lie in bed for half a year. His wife will be lonely." The other young jailer laughed upon hearing this. The former jailer suddenly turned his head and shouted, "Do you want to see a performance?" "Performance?" The people in the other cages who were eating the dark bread looked up. One of them took the lead and shouted, "Yes, yes." The people in the other cages didn't fall behind and quickly responded. Chapter 145. Hearing his words, obese middle-aged man's face slightly changed. He wanted to let the others grab all the food that was allocated today and not let Dean eat. At night, he would let the others take turns to consume Dean's spirit, not letting him sleep. When Dean's energy was exhausted, he could easily dispose of him. He didn't expect the 2 jailers to complicate matters. Fatty's eyes showed ruthlessness. Although he was angry at the 2 jailers for being nosy, he was not afraid. Let alone a wounded child. Even if it was a strong wolf, he would dare to pounce on it and bite it a few times. "Let's start," the jailer who knew Dean said with a smile. "If there is no winner, then both of you will eat dirt." Fatty took a deep breath and slowly stood up from the mat. Although there was a dull pain on his feet, but in the face of a real battle, he was able to restrain himself. Step by step, he steadily walked towards Dean. Dean leaned against the cage. His whole body was aching. He frowned as he looked at Fatty, slowly approaching. He suddenly looked up at the jailer. "Can I admit defeat?" The jailer smiled. "Little guy, you'd better not spoil my mood. Everyone is watching. You can rest assured that this fat pig won't dare to kill you. Only we can execute scum like you." Fatty squeezed his fist and grinned. "Boy, you should beg for mercy from me. Call me ancestor, and I will give you one less punch." Dean took back his eyes, sighed, and murmured, "Unfortunately, I don't want such a stupid descendant like you. You are courting death." Fatty's face twitched. His eyes were full of anger and killing intent. But he was not provoked and careless. He was well aware of the role of the people who could enter this prison. He immediately took a deep breath and aimed at Dean's shoulder injury. His eyes flashed slightly. He suddenly lifted his foot and swept out. Whoosh! The wind whistled, and the momentum was great. Dean stared at him coldly, like a tiger on the ground. He looked at the foot and slightly raised his arm. Seeing him raise his arm, Fatty's foot suddenly stopped. It was a feint attack. Dean's arm also fell. The obese, middle-aged man secretly sneered in his heart. "Fight with me?" He lifted his leg again, and it was another powerful kick. Dean saw him lift his foot and raise his arm slightly. The fat, middle-aged man retracted his foot once again and feigned another attack. He walked a few steps, changed his angle, and raised his leg to kick again. Again, it was a feint. These 7 or 8 consecutive kicks were all feints. As the saying goes, nothing happens more than 3 times. After so many feints, no one will be able to tell if the opponent's next attack would be a real one. The advantage of feigning an attack was that it could deceive the opponent into fully concentrating on defense every time. This was very taxing on one's stamina, energy, and patience. The difference between a defenseless person and a prepared person was like heaven and earth. "Fat pig, can you do it? You're so timid. You're indeed fat, but your heart is weak." The people in the other cells next to him jeered. Although their words were full of ridicule, but all of them secretly cursed the fat pig for being cunning. To deal with an injured kid, he still used such a dirty trick. However, thinking of the previous words of the jailer, no one dared to despise Dean. On the first day, he let the jailer go out lying on the ground. Such a character was extremely difficult to deal with. The obese middle-aged man was not affected by the others at all. He did not decide to attack because of the ridicule of others. However, his face showed a very angry look. Almost all the onlookers in the other cells thought that he really could not stand the provocation and would attack. However, when they saw that it was another feint, everyone suddenly lost their temper. Even the ridicule felt boring. Fatty raised his foot 7 or 8 times in a row to feint. Dean's breathing was getting heavier and heavier. Perhaps it was because he was too tired. Sometimes when he saw Fatty's kick, he was too lazy to defend. Suddenly, the obese middle-aged man's legs swept out in the same posture as before. The moment he kicked, Fatty's small eyes revealed a strong, killing intent. Everyone thought that the kick was a feint attack and would be withdrawn halfway. However, this time it didn't. Instead, it directly kicked Dean's shoulder, which made everyone's heart shiver. Dean, who had been panting slightly, suddenly stopped panting at this moment. Previously, he was almost powerless to lift his arm, but this time he suddenly raised it. Like an eagle's claw, he accurately grabbed Fatty's foot and pulled it out of the cell. At this time, everyone suddenly noticed that Dean's arm had stretched out through the iron pillar of the cell. This pull directly pulled Fatty's foot out from the middle of the iron pillar. The latter suddenly fell to the ground due to a big split. His body lost balance and fell to the ground. Dean clenched his teeth in pain because of the nail in his shoulder blade. He suddenly rushed out from his sitting position. When the opponent fell to the ground, his left hand grabbed his hair and fiercely threw him to the ground. Originally, under the penetration of the nail in his shoulder blade, his arms were not only in pain, but also unable to exert strength. However, after the previous slow sensing, Dean found that his left hand could still exert strength. Previously, he had relied on the strength of his left hand to repel the others. His left hand was eroded by the cold crystal, so he couldn't feel it. Although the internal muscles would still affect the nail in his shoulder blade, he could exert the same strength as before. However, the greater the eruption of strength, the greater the impact of the nail and the heavier the pain would be. However, he knew that this was the hope that he had to grasp. A strong desire to survive made him almost explode in pain and burst out with all his strength. Bang! The fat middle-aged man's forehead hit the ground hard, especially the split posture, which almost made him faint from the pain. The pain in his waist, spine, and crotch made him want to scream. Although he had done a lot of bad things, it did not mean that he could bear great pain. Dean clenched his teeth and grabbed his hair. He didn't wait for him to grab back, and his fingers suddenly poked out. Puff! Almost at the same time, the index and middle fingers of his left hand deeply inserted into Fatty's eye sockets. The 2 eyeballs were suddenly squeezed out, but Dean's fingers were clasped down, tightly clasping the eyeballs left and right. Ah! Fatty almost went crazy from the pain. He raised his arms and punched randomly. A punch hit Dean's abdomen, affecting the previous injuries caused by torture. Dean's face turned pale. Seeing that his eyes were blind, he immediately loosened his fingers, took a few steps back, fell to the ground, and gasped for breath. His best opportunity was to take the initiative to sneak attack when the opponent feigned an attack. Chapter 146. This sudden turn of events stunned everyone. Everyone shuddered as they looked at the obese middle-aged man who was lying on the ground and howling in pain. Dean leaned against the cage next to him, gasping for breath, suppressing the pain in his body. There was no trace of emotion in his eyes as he listened to the miserable screams of the other party. After a moment, the obese middle-aged man covered his eyes. He was slightly accustomed to the pain. He resisted the panic in his heart and raised his hand angrily to sweep around. He was afraid that Dean would take the opportunity to attack again. At the same time, he wanted to catch Dean and fight with him. He knew what it meant to be blind. Not to mention that there was another injured tiger in this cage. Come out! Come out! The obese middle-aged man roared angrily. His eyes were bloodshot, and blood slid down his cheeks and dripped on his thick, hairy chest. There was no killing intent in Dean's eyes. He just silently looked at the obese man. Seeing the obese man coming towards him, Dean immediately bent down on the steel column of another cage and made a sound with his fingers. Seeing Dean's action, the people in the other cages next to him secretly thought that he was cunning. At the same time, they faintly felt that if this kid could resist this attack, he would become an existence like a tiger in this prison in the future. The obese middle-aged man roared and rushed over when he heard the sound. He raised his hand and fiercely hit the steel column. He immediately bent down and pounced to the left and right, but he didn't touch Dean's figure. He immediately realized that he was fooled. He didn't rush, but stood still and relied on his hearing to sense the movement around him. Fat pig, come on. On your left, on your left. Are you blind? On your left. Oh, you are really blind. Some of the people in the other cells next to him didn't have the slightest sympathy. They laughed and deliberately said in the opposite direction. In fact, Dean was on the right. However, the people living in this prison had already seen the clues. They knew that the obese middle-aged man couldn't make it. Instead of offending an injured tiger, it was better to offend a tiger without teeth. The surrounding noise seriously interfered with the hearing of the obese middle-aged man. He angrily roared, "Shut up! Shut up! All of you, shut up! Don't shout! He is going to pounce. Behind you. Be careful!" The others reminded him, but their faces were full of ridicule. They couldn't help but laugh heartily when they saw that the obese middle-aged man had listened to their warnings and reacted to them. Dean sat in a dark corner, expressionlessly looking at the fat middle-aged man who was like a headless fly scratching in front of the cage. The laughter around him made the coldness in his eyes gradually disappear, leaving only silence. Where is he? The obese middle-aged man thought of his subordinates and roared. They looked at Dean's position, but saw that Dean also turned his head to look at them. Through the blood-stained, messy hair on his face, they could still see a pair of indifferent eyes. They looked at each other and hesitated to be silent. Among them was a young man with a sturdy physique. He gritted his teeth and said, "Boss, he's at the wall on your left." Fatty heard his words and immediately rushed towards Dudian's direction. Dean's eyes were cold as he immediately dodged. At the same time, he dragged his body and ran towards the sturdy youth. "Come to me, I'm here." The sturdy youth saw Dean rushing towards him, and his face showed a bit of panic as he hurriedly shouted. Fatty heard the words and immediately rushed towards the direction of the voice. Dean saw that the others were hesitating. It seemed that they were ready to join forces to resist. His heart sank as he squeezed out a voice from his teeth. "Do you want to continue to mix with the waste? If you don't want to die, then get out of here." Several people heard Dean's words. Their faces changed, and one after another avoided. Only the sturdy youth stood in the same place. His face was ugly as he said, "You bastards, if the boss dies, he will come back and clean us up." The few people looked at each other, but didn't make any response. The sturdy youth immediately knew their plan. He cursed in his heart and dodged to the left. He didn't dare to confront Dean head-on. Dean panted as he forced the sturdy youth to the left corner. After all, the cell was so big, and although the sturdy youth was physically strong, but he was just an ordinary civilian criminal. He was quickly forced to the corner by Dean. "Boss, I'm here, come quickly." The sturdy youth hurriedly shouted. The obese middle-aged man roared and rushed over. Dean panted as he slowly raised his left hand to grab the sturdy youth. The sturdy youth had nowhere to retreat. He fiercely clenched his teeth and raised his fist to hit Dean's shoulder blade. Dean deliberately moved slowly. He was waiting for this moment. His wrist moved and pinched the fist. He turned around and threw it towards the fat middle-aged man. The sturdy youth tried to resist, but he was horrified to find that his fist was like being strangled by steel. There was a feeling of fragmentation. Moreover, the figure who was half a head shorter than him had terrifying strength that he couldn't resist. However, he reacted very quickly and quickly raised his hand to hit Dean's other shoulder blade. Dean didn't stop him, and he was unable to lift his right hand. He suddenly squatted down. The sturdy youth punched the air. He was about to take back his fist and continue to attack, but his pupil shrank, and he cried out, "Boss!" Bang! Fatty's fist suddenly hit the sturdy youth's chest, which was originally the height of Dean's head. The sturdy youth spurted a mouthful of blood and was smashed against the wall. His face was full of pain as he groaned, "Boss, it's me." He is squatting down there. Fatty heard this and quickly squatted down to attack. Dean had already rolled away. His bare feet stepped on the ground, and like a black cat, he quietly crawled to another place. Fatty pounced left and right, but couldn't find him. He angrily roared, "Where did he go?" The sturdy youth gasped and pointed at him. Dean's face was extremely gloomy. He dodged left and right, affecting the injuries of his body. The pain made his hands and feet tremble. Several other people saw the tragic situation of the sturdy youth. They were afraid of being accidentally injured by Fatty, so they also ran left and right in the cell. Their footsteps seriously disturbed Fatty. After a few minutes, Fatty didn't touch Dean's body. He suddenly roared and turned to the injured, sturdy youth, roaring, "Do you want to hurt me? Do you want to hurt me?" He raised his fist and fiercely smashed it. The sturdy youth was shocked. Seeing the punch coming, he cried in horror, "Boss, don't, I didn't bang." The fist followed the sound to find his head and hit the bridge of the nose. The sturdy youth suddenly fainted. Seeing this, the others were pale. They knew that the sturdy youth didn't believe anyone, so they didn't dare to make a sound. Chapter 147. Well, that's the end of the game. The former guard shrugged his shoulders and threw 2 pieces of cheap black bread into the cage. He looked at Dean. "Eat, little guy." Dean was relieved and was about to pick it up. The obese, middle-aged man suddenly roared and rushed towards the source of the voice. He fumbled around on the ground and picked up 2 pieces of bread and stuffed them into his mouth. "Shut up, you scoundrel!" the jailer roared angrily. The obese, middle-aged man didn't care and desperately stuffed it into his mouth. "Fat pig, you are courting death." One of the jailers was infuriated. He took out the key and opened the cage. He took out the stick from the cart and ruthlessly whipped the fat, middle-aged man's back and head. He didn't care where the fatal spots were and continued to whip the fat, middle-aged man's face. Fatty screamed a few times in pain. He threw away the crumbled black bread and desperately shrank back. "Let you eat, let you eat." The 2 jailers angrily whipped the fat, middle-aged man with their sticks and raised their feet to kick his face and chest. The other people were silent as they saw them beating Fatty. They retreated and didn't dare to come close. The guards are the highest existence in the prison. They could control their life and death. Under the continuous whipping of the 2 jailers, the fat, middle-aged man screamed in pain, "I won't dare! I won't dare! Please spare my life, my lord." The 2 jailers didn't care. After a series of punches and kicks, they saw the obese, middle-aged man lying in a pool of blood. Only then did they stop. They spat on his face and turned to leave the cell. Dean looked at the crumbled bread on the ground. He wanted to talk to the 2, but after hesitating, he didn't say anything. He silently picked up the crumbled bread on the ground and ate it little by little. He hadn't eaten for 6 or 7 days in the prison. He was hungry and exhausted. At this moment, he could even bite the bark of a tree. The 2 prison guards pushed the cart and continued to distribute food to the people in the other cells behind them. After they left, the 2 of them pushed the empty cart and left. They laughed as they walked and talked about the food they planned to order when they went to the canteen. The people in the surrounding cells heard the words roasted chicken, steak, foie gras, and so on. Everything seemed to be calm again. The people in each cell ate the bread they had snatched as fast as they could, and then began to chat with each other listlessly. They talked about women, the scenery outside, and their past glory. Dean silently ate the bread. He felt that the burning hunger in his stomach had slightly subsided. His body had recovered some strength. Although the 2 pieces of bread were not enough to fill his stomach, but he had been hungry for so many days. Eating too much at once would hurt his stomach. 2 pieces of bread was just enough for him to digest. Dean half closed his eyes to rest and restore his physical strength. The others carefully looked at Dean, then looked at the fat, middle-aged man who was moaning from time to time in a pool of blood. They didn't dare to approach. Dean wasn't the only one who was pierced by the steel nails. Every criminal who was sent to prison would enjoy the same treatment. The only difference was that they were used to it. The steel nails had grown in their flesh. As long as they avoided strenuous activities, they wouldn't feel the sting of the steel nails. This was another reason why it was difficult for them to besiege Dean. "Little guy, what did you do before? Tell us." At this time, a voice came from another cell. The people in the other cells immediately echoed, "Yes, yes, join our happy little family. You haven't introduced yourself yet." Dean slowly opened his eyes and indifferently glanced at the people. "I'm not like you garbage. I didn't commit a crime." Hearing his words, laughter came from the other cages. "Little guy, you don't want to say that you were wronged, do you? Haha, everyone who comes in is like you. But in the end, they will be very happy to integrate into this small family. I'll ask who is not wronged. Come and raise your hand." As soon as these words came out, the other cages immediately responded. Dean slightly frowned, but didn't say anything. He closed his eyes. Several people cautiously approached him. Dean opened his eyes and stared at them. One of them smiled. "I didn't mean to offend you. There's some crumbs here." He tentatively reached out to pick up a crumb from the ground. He slowly put it into his mouth as he saw that Dean didn't respond. Dean realized that he was wasting the crumbs, but he didn't say anything. He closed his eyes and quietly rested. In the evening, the 2 guards pushed the cart again. One of them said in a loud voice, "Today, I'll give you more benefits. There's a steak. Who wants it?" The quiet cells were in an uproar as they heard his words. "Me. I want it. Give it to me, elder." The guard was very satisfied as he saw such a warm response. He raised his hand and said, "There's only one steak. There are so many people who want it. Do you know how to do it according to the old rules?" The response from the cells died down as they heard the guard's words. Dean leaned against the cage and silently looked at them. He saw that one person in 2 of the cages said, "I want it." The 2 jailers glanced at them and said with some dissatisfaction, "Looks like you're both full. Just the 2 of you?" They saw that there was no response from the other cells. They coldly said, "Then you can fight for it." They opened the locks of the 2 cages. 2 people stepped out of the cages. One of them was the Scar youth who had previously said that he wanted Dean. "Scar, don't fight with me." A blonde youth came out of the other cell. Scar sneered, "It depends on your own ability." He took the lead to attack. Dean silently watched. After a few minutes, the winner was Scar. His face was red and swollen. He gasped and said, "Elder, I won." "I know." The guard handed out the steak. Scar reached out his hand to take it. The steak fell to the ground. There were several rows of bite marks on the steak. It was obvious that it was a leftover piece. The guard spat and said in a disgusted tone, "Do you think that I don't know that you want to eat steak? Do you think that I don't know that you are deliberately acting?" Scar's face slightly changed. "I can't wait for Elder to drag him out and peel off a layer of skin." The jailer sneered and said, "As you wish." Scar's eyelids twitched, but his expression remained unchanged. The blonde youth who was beaten to the ground roared at Scar, "Damn beast. I curse you to die a horrible death." The jailer waited for Scar to pick up the steak and then locked him in the cage. Then he continued to push the cart and distributed bread to the other cages. When all the bread was empty, the jailer left with the cart along with the blonde youth. When the door above the corridor was locked, the heavy atmosphere in the cells on both sides of the corridor was immediately relieved. These 2 damn beasts. Unlucky old Gene. Indignation and sighs came from the cages. Dean picked up the 4 pieces of bread that were thrown at the door of the cage. He looked back at the hungry eyes of several people in the dark. "Who wants to come and grab it?" Several people saw Dean pick up the bread in a coherent movement. How would they dare to snatch food from him? They quickly shook their heads. One of them said in a flattering tone, "You are our boss in the future. If you have any command, just say it. We will follow you." Dean had sensed the rules of survival in the prison. He didn't say anything as he slowly ate the bread. After eating 2 pieces, he stuffed the remaining 2 pieces into his arms and prepared to eat them later in the night. Several people looked at him with envy, but didn't dare to come forward to grab it. They could only continue to flatter Dean. Dean was indifferent. He understood that no amount of rhetoric was more important than his own strength. At this time, Dean noticed that the youth called Scar in the next cage didn't eat the steak, but hid it in his arms. A trace of desire flashed in his eyes. Scar noticed Dean's gaze and smiled. "Little guy, everyone here calls me Scar. What's your name?" "Dean," Dudian replied. He didn't have any bad feelings towards this person for saving him, but he also didn't have a good impression of him. Scar nodded and smiled. "Were you a hunter or a knight of the magistrate? Were you a knight of light?" Dean wrinkled his brows, but didn't answer. Scar seemed to be aware that there were some secrets involved. He smiled but didn't say anything. Dean asked, "Why aren't you eating?" Scar knew what Dean was referring to. He sighed. "Jean has suffered a lot this time. This is for him." Dean knew that Jean was the blonde youth who was dragged out. His eyes flashed. "Are you acting?" Scar looked at him and thought for a moment. He nodded slightly and said, "Yes, these bastards will occasionally give us some good things. But every time they want to see us kill each other. So we decided to act it out. We don't have to risk our lives every time. After all, the injuries we get are not worth it compared to the things we get. Originally, this time it was mine. But these 2 bastards have harmed Jean, so I will give him compensation." Dean looked at the other cells. "Do the others agree?" Scar nodded. "If no one fights for it, then these 2 bastards will embezzle the food for all of us. So we have to act." Dean was silent as he heard his words. More than an hour later, the blonde youth was dragged back by 2 guards. His body was covered with blood. He was thrown into his cell and didn't move for a long time. After the 2 guards left, Scar shouted "Old Jean" twice. Seeing Jin's reaction, he threw the steak to him. "I left it for you. Eat it. You have suffered a lot today." The blonde youth got up with the help of the guards. He turned around and said, "It's nothing. One day I will pierce the asterisk shoal of these bastards." Scar sighed and shook his head. In the blink of an eye, it was midnight. Dean ate the remaining 2 pieces of bread and closed his eyes to continue to rest. Not long after he fell asleep, he suddenly felt an extremely soft sound approaching him. He immediately opened his eyes and saw a skinny young man among the group of people tiptoeing towards him. The thin youth was shocked as he saw Dean open his eyes. He didn't think that such a small movement would alarm Dean. He quickly waved his hand and apologized. Dean didn't say anything and closed his eyes again. The people who were sleeping in the other cells were awakened by this person. They looked up and understood what was going on. They fell back to sleep. The next day, Dean felt that the pain in his body had reduced a lot. His wounds had long been scarred. The steel nails on his shoulder blade were still aching. It seemed to be inflamed and the wound was slightly ulcerated. However, there were no knives or first aid items around. He could only smear his saliva on the wound. There were 2 meals a day, noon and evening. At noon, 3 pieces of bread were thrown. Dean didn't monopolize them. He ate 2 and threw the remaining 1 to the guards. After all, a corner dog will jump over a wall. He just wanted to heal as soon as possible and didn't want to tear his wounds again. Although it was just a piece of bread, the guards didn't fight for it. Instead, they divided a small piece equally. Dean understood that although no one was trustworthy, but at least they had built a tacit understanding with each other. Only such a tacit understanding could allow them to survive. Just like Scar and Jean, just like the others in the prison. The result of breaking the tacit understanding was inevitable that someone would die, like the fat middle-aged man. Under Dean's eye gouging and the jailer's beatings, the obese middle-aged man's momentum was gone. His body was seriously injured, and there was no nursing care or treatment. Injuries meant that his status would rapidly decline unless he was like Dean. Even if he was injured, he could still suppress others. Chapter 148. The next night, Fatty gradually woke up. He groaned and wanted to climb up, but his whole body was in pain. Especially the jailer's kicks had affected the steel nails under his shoulder blades. At the moment, his hands were soft and powerless. He couldn't get up for a while. He roared angrily. "Are you all dead? Come and help me." The few people shrank back and looked at each other. They looked at Dean, but didn't dare to make a move. Even the sturdy youth who reminded him shrank back in the corner and didn't say a word. The fat middle-aged man roared a few times. Seeing that no one responded to him, the fear and sorrow in his heart made him even angrier. But he already understood that he had been abandoned. An injured, blind tiger, even if he revealed a fierce expression, would not be able to control the others. Moreover, he wasn't like Jean and Scar, who had a high prestige in the prison. Even among the cell leaders, he was one of the best. Even if one of them was seriously injured, no one would dare to bully him. Loneliness, helplessness, despair, darkness. It was as if he had experienced the first time he was thrown into prison. At that time, he cried and was violated. He forced a smile and flattered others. It was not until his term as the boss was up and he was sentenced to death that he got the chance to be promoted. Now he fell again. Dean silently looked at him and didn't say anything. After a moment, the dinner was delivered. This time he was luckier as 4 pieces of bread were thrown in. Dean picked them all up. Fatty heard the sound and suddenly crawled up, but he didn't rush to snatch the bread. Instead, he kowtowed in the direction of Dean and begged, "I beg you, spare me. You're my boss. I admit defeat. I will be your thug in the future. I will do whatever you want me to do. Please don't hate me." Dean slightly frowned. He didn't expect that the reversal would be so big. He thought that Fatty would fight back in despair. After a moment of silence, he looked at the others. "Do you think I should forgive him?" The people who were sitting on the straw mats looked at the black bread in Dean's hand. One of them tentatively whispered, "Boss, why don't you forgive him? We are assigned a job in each prison. If we abolish him, then there will be one less person to do the work. It will be a loss." Dean nodded slightly. After the 2 guards left, he said, "Break one of his arms and the 3rd leg." The others were stunned. The fat middle-aged man's face changed. He couldn't help but clench his fists on the ground, but then he loosened them and begged, "Big brother, they are right. We have to work every week. If my arm is broken, I will become a cripple. The work will be divided equally among everyone. You will also suffer." Dean quietly looked at him. "Do you think I need to work by myself?" The obese middle-aged man was startled. The faces of the others changed. They knew the meaning of Dean's words. They didn't expect that their days would still be like this after the change of boss. They couldn't help but feel sad and indignant. Dean looked at them. Is no one going to make a move? The few of them looked at each other. There was anger in their hearts, but they maintained a tacit understanding and kept quiet. Dean took out 2 pieces of black bread from his arms. "Whoever is obedient, this belongs to him." The guard had used this trick in the past 2 days. Now he was using it. The few of them hesitated. Finally, one of them stepped forward and said, "I'll do it, but I'm afraid I can't beat him." Dudian looked at the obese middle-aged man. "Did you hear me? I believe that if you are smart, then you won't resist. Otherwise, you will lose more than one hand. If my speculation is correct, then the rules here are very simple. There are only 2 rules. You're not allowed to kill and ensure the workload. So a little torture shouldn't be a problem." The obese, middle-aged man's body trembled as he heard the words, "a little torture." He was angry, but also afraid. He knew that Dean was completely right. As long as there was no killing and it didn't affect the workload, the guards would be happy to see a dog-eat-dog situation. Dean took out 2 pieces of black bread and gently bit it. He said while eating, "The show can begin." The others looked at the black bread he was chewing. They gritted their teeth and went forward to surround the obese middle-aged man. The people in the other cells naturally noticed the situation here, but there was no laughter. Everyone felt a faint chill. They had seen vicious criminals and murderous devils, but they had never seen a person who could adapt so quickly. Dean wasn't purely retaliating. There was no trace of hatred or killing intent in his words. Instead, there was a kind of calmness. It was this calmness that made people feel an extremely dangerous atmosphere. Blood-curdling screams and furious roars resounded in the prison. The sound waves surged against the steel pillars of the cage, and then they were ruthlessly smashed into pieces. Dean was chewing the black bread that tasted like expired food, quietly watching the scene in front of him. When he finished eating, the atrocity in front of him was also over, leaving only the fat middle-aged man lying in a pool of blood. His crotch was blood red, and his left hand was broken. The performance was over. Several people looked at the black bread in Dean's hand. Dean was very trustworthy. He didn't say much. He threw the black bread into the blood of the obese middle-aged man. The few of them hurriedly picked it up, divided it up quickly, and ate it randomly. Days passed, although Dean didn't make a move again. But the people here were not fools. From his initial struggle, they could see that he was not an ordinary person, but a warrior with super strength. After all, there were some things that couldn't be done by anger. They had seen too many people who struggled in anger and despair. But in the end, their unyielding heads were pressed down and laid on the ground for them to enjoy. Pure anger was completely useless in the face of absolute power, and it would only make one feel even more sorrowful and sad. In the past few days, Dudian had occasionally talked to Scar. He knew that the prison was located at the bottom of the lake. There were 3 floors in the prison. They were on the first floor, which meant that they were the weakest criminals in the prison. To prove that a criminal was weak and strong, in addition to relying on their own strength, they also had committed crimes outside. Dean was charged with theft, so he naturally belonged to the weakest category. In the past few days, Dean also learned about the crimes committed by the obese middle-aged man and several others. The obese middle-aged man was like his appearance. He used to be a wealthy businessman. He was imprisoned for molesting a noble lady. However, it was precisely because of his identity as a wealthy businessman that he had the opportunity to purchase God's blessing from the black market. That was why his strength was so much higher than ordinary people, equivalent to a junior scavenger. Chapter 149. In addition to the obese middle-aged man, the rest of them were from residential areas and slums. Most of their crimes were murder, imprisonment, and so on. The main reason why 8 Delta Literature Network was locked up in this number 1 prison was because the targets of their crimes were either nobles or the Radiant Church, or because their crimes had been leaked and spread far and wide, resulting in a negative impact. On the 5th day of Dean's imprisonment, more than a dozen jailers suddenly came to the cell. They opened the cages and ordered everyone to come out. Dean knew that they were going to start their weekly work. Although nearly 100 prisoners came out of the cages, but there was no collective riot or resistance. There were 2 main reasons. The first was that the piercing effect of the steel nails was too strong. Even a hunter like Dean would feel weak after being pierced by the nails. If he used too much force, it would tear the nail wound. Moreover, many ordinary people who were pierced by the nails couldn't even hold a bird to pee. The second reason was that the guards outside the prison were too strong. Once there was a riot, they would immediately send people to suppress it. Dean's idea of using this opportunity to kill the jailers to escape was stillborn. Under the leadership of the jailer, everyone came to the 2nd floor of the prison. This floor was not a place for prisoners with a death sentence, but a huge processing plant. No one knew how many floors there were in the whole prison. Dean was startled when he saw the things piled up on the workbench. These were the limbs of various monsters. They were cut very carefully. The fur was intact, and the horns were complete. "Time to work, scum." The jailer closed the heavy iron door and shouted at the crowd with a stick in his hand. Everyone came to their respective workbenches step by step. There was a small team in each cage. They occupied a workbench and picked the monster corpses. They skinned, classified, cut corners, and so on. Dean put on his work clothes and protective gloves in front of the locker. Although the gloves were made of treated fabric fibers, but the protective effect was far from the gloves made of plastic and nylon materials. Fortunately, the monster's limbs were brought back from the giant wall and transported here. The blood had long dried up and the hair was dry and hard. Most of the viruses, germs, and parasites that were contaminated with the hair had died. Considering the poor protection of the gloves, Dean didn't do anything. Instead, he quietly watched the middle-aged man and the others who were busy in front of the workbench. They peeled off the fur from the monster's limbs and neatly piled them on the side. They used a guillotine and dagger to cut off the monster's horns, sharp teeth, claws, and other parts of the monster. Obviously, this wasn't the first time they had done such a thing. In front of the other workbenches, the leaders in the cages didn't make any moves either. They just stood there and watched quietly. Dean was playing with a very thin knife as he thought in his heart. Several hours passed. Everyone finished their work and lined up to return. However, before leaving, the jailer arranged for everyone to strip naked and come to the bathroom next door to wash their bodies. Dean saw that the hands of the middle-aged man and the others were slightly red and swollen, as if they had been bitten by mosquitoes. However, they were used to it. Before leaving, everyone was strictly checked by the jailer. From the mouth, ears, nostrils, and even the buttocks, they were all checked. After confirming that no one was carrying anything, they were allowed to leave. In the evening, when the food was distributed, 4 pieces were thrown in. Dean picked them all up. He kept 2 pieces, and the remaining 2 pieces were thrown to the others. Time passed day by day. The days in the prison were extremely boring, especially after 2 weeks of Dean's imprisonment. The prison returned to its calm again. Few people were interested in talking. In each cage, crying and moaning sounds echoed in the prison from time to time during the day and in the middle of the night. These moaning sounds attracted more restlessness. In Dean's cage, except for Dean who had no interest in it, the others would secretly look at Dean when they heard the moaning sounds in the other cages. Some of them couldn't bear it and would help each other. Since the lower body of the middle-aged man was blown up, the desire in this area was completely gone. Occasionally he would feel envious, but he was able to endure it. Dean noticed that many people were looking at him while doing this kind of thing. Their eyes were full of desire and greed. Needless to say, he knew what they were thinking in their heads. From the initial disgust and faint anger, Dean gradually became indifferent. He didn't want to be angry because of these things. His words were getting less and less, and he was getting quieter and quieter. Occasionally, he would ask some strange questions. These questions involved astrology, business, as well as the giant wall, radiation zone, and so on. Many people were happy to answer Dean's questions. In addition to Dean's strength, it was also because the life in the prison was too boring. If they could find 1 or 2 topics, it would cause a lot of people to participate in the discussion. However, when it came to matters related to their privacy, many people would warily ignore it. However, there were still a few people who were willing to share their families, hobbies, and their past glorious crimes. 3 months after Dean's imprisonment, the prison attracted a new partner to join the happy little family. It was a young man with a gentleman's temperament. Although he was wearing death sentence uniform, his shoulders were still raised. He was handsome and had sword-like eyebrows. When he was dragged in by the jailers, he immediately attracted the enthusiastic attention of everyone. One by one, they stretched out their hands from the cage, eager to be assigned to their own cage. The jailers naturally wouldn't listen to the prisoners. They threw the young man into a cage behind Dean. The young man was thrown into the cage. He groaned and climbed up. He turned back and shouted, "I'm wronged. I'm wronged. I want to appeal. I want to appeal." The response was a sneer from the jailer. After the jailer left, laughter came from the back of the young man. Like all the previous newcomers, the welcome ceremony was held not far from Dean. He silently watched as the young man was thrown to the ground by several people in the cage. The young man struggled fiercely, but it didn't work. Eventually, his cries echoed throughout the prison. The people in other cages were excited. For a time, many people in the cages groaned and laughed. Dean quietly watched the young man being pressed to the ground about 3 meters away from him. He found that his mood wasn't the slightest bit affected. Although the young man's screams reminded him of himself 3 months ago, but he didn't say anything to stop them. The young man's screams continued for several days. In the end, he was like a dead fish that was played with by several people in the cage. A week later, the young man had recognized the situation. When he saw the jailer, he didn't cry anymore. 2 weeks later, the young man had adapted to his role. He silently endured the attacks of several people and didn't cry anymore. Half a month later, the young man had completely integrated into the prison. Occasionally, he would have the strength to talk and laugh with the other people in the cage. The first person he found was Dean in the next cage. But Dean didn't pay attention to him. The young man was naturally not satisfied that a kid dared to ignore him. He was immediately enraged. He cursed Dean with vicious words that many resentful women couldn't say. But he didn't say a few words. Obese middle-aged man and others scolded him back. After some threats, the leader of the cage slapped the young man on the spot and made him kneel down and apologize to Dean. He had seen the leader of the cage before. In the second month of Dean's imprisonment, he was selected by the jailer to perform with another leader of the cage. Due to the lack of communication between the two, the leader of the cage tried to kill Dean. As a result, Dean punched him and broke his ribs. He almost died from internal bleeding. Since then, all the leaders of the cage clearly realized that although Dean was young, his strength was far more terrible than they had imagined. After receiving 2 slaps, the young man also understood that this seemingly thin and weak child's status in this prison was completely not on the same level as his. 1 month later, another one who was crying injustice. A 7-year-old child was raped. How dare he cry injustice? Scar, who was on the other side of the cage, heard the conversation between the young man and the others. He couldn't help but shake his head and smile. He looked at Dean and said, "I told you that 9 out of 10 people are guilty. The remaining one is guilty of a heinous crime. You are so young, but you have such ability. The crimes you have committed are certainly not small." Dean heard him and indifferently said, "I told you that I am not the same as you garbage." Scar smiled and said, "You are still so arrogant after coming in for so long. You are eating the same bread and drinking the same water as us. Apart from the fact that you haven't been opened, there seems to be no difference." Chapter 150. Time flew by. Dean had been in prison for a year. During this year, Dean had collected information about the entire Thornflower prison through the chatter of other prisoners and jailers. Occasionally, he would ask Scar and other old people to get the answer. Although asking would expose his intention of jailbreak, but as long as the jailer didn't know about it, it would be fine. After all, there was no one who didn't want to escape, but they couldn't. Through the collected information, Dean had the same feeling. First of all, the first difficulty made 90% of the people give up the idea of jailbreak. This Thornflower prison was built at the bottom of the lake. Dean had seen a lot of monsters wandering in the lake. Did they want to break out of the prison? It was simply suicide. Moreover, this prison could withstand the pressure of the lake and the impact of the underwater monsters. Its thickness and firmness were naturally extraordinary. Wanting to dig a hole in the wall was simply a fool's dream. Therefore, the people who entered here, no matter how unwilling or how eager they were to leave, could only accept their fate. Dean was also desperate when he knew about this situation. But after a few days of despair, he suddenly felt that there was nothing to do while sitting in the cage. His mind was completely blank, and the prison life became more painful because of this. So he regained his mood and continued to fall into his own jailbreak plan. This time, he started from zero and thought about many possibilities of jailbreak. Finally, he sorted it out and divided it into 2 types: external and internal. The external referred to the method of digging the wall, breaking the cage, and so on, starting from the prison itself. However, this road was blocked early on, not to mention that he didn't have the tools to dig. Even if he secretly brought tools from the weekly workshop, he didn't know how many years it would take for him to dig out of the prison. Moreover, the first time he dug out the wall, he would die with everyone in the prison and be swallowed by the monsters in the lake. Therefore, this road was abandoned by Dean. If he couldn't start from the prison, then he could only start from the inside. That was the jailer. Attack the jailer? There were layers of guards outside. The jailer dared to let them work collectively. Naturally, they weren't afraid of riots. Dean thought a soft way: bribing the jailer. Not long after he had this thought, he dismissed it again. This was because he had seen a newcomer who had just entered the prison implement such a method. In the end, the newcomer was dragged out by the prison guards and tortured until he was on the verge of death before being thrown back. Obviously, bribery was futile. It wasn't that the jailers weren't greedy, but they had better ways to extract every ounce of value from you. After thinking about it, Dean felt that there was nothing he could do. This prison was like an impenetrable fortress. There was no way to break it. Was he going to die of old age and exhaustion in prison? Another half a year passed. Dean suddenly went crazy. He roared and screamed, saying some crazy nonsense, and even attacked the people in his cell, beating them half to death. When the two jailers came over, they saw the prisoners in Dean's cell lying on the ground. They saw Dean lying on top of them and continued to punch indiscriminately. They were furious. They opened the cell and dragged Dean out of the cell. They threw him on the corridor and punched and kicked him. Dean roared and raised his fist and rushed to the two jailers. His strength was so great that the two jailers were immediately knocked down to the ground. This scene stunned the people in the other cells. No one thought that Dean's scapula was pierced by a steel nail, but he still had such a powerful strength. One of the jailers got up and ran away. Soon, he called 4 or 5 jailers and threw Dean to the ground. The jailers dragged Dean out after a round of beatings. More than an hour later, the jailers dragged the dying Dean back and threw him back to his cell. A few days later, Dean's injuries were healed. He shouted and knocked over the obese middle-aged man and others who had just regained some strength. At this time, the jailer came to deliver food. He saw this scene and immediately rushed over to stop him. Dean roared, overturned the cart, and wrestled with the jailer. The two jailers couldn't suppress him. One of them was beaten by him and vomited blood, while the other ran away. Soon, Dean was dragged out by more jailers. After being tortured, he was dragged back. This time, Dean was not put in the previous cell, but in a separate cell. Damn, this madman crippled those wastes. They can't complete their task. Distribute him to the other cells. The jailers were angry, but they just tortured Dean and didn't kill him. In fact, the jailers didn't have the right to deal with prisoners at will. Torture was a small matter, and it was within their rights. But if they killed him, the higher-ups would inevitably ask. Although they could give some gifts, flatter a few words, or some other background relationship, they could cover it up, but it would inevitably be troublesome. Moreover, they had seen too many people like Dean who went crazy in prison. Day after day in a dark place, people with weak willpower would often become depressed after 3 to 5 years. Some would go crazy, and some would commit suicide. Therefore, a situation like Dean's was not uncommon, but they didn't think that Dean would go crazy so fast. However, thinking of Dean's age, they were relieved. No matter how brave and strong he was, after all, he was only a child. His temperament was inevitably far from that of an adult. While in solitary confinement, the jailers also reduced Dean's food, often only a piece of black bread a day. Dean's body was getting thinner, his eye sockets were deep, his cheekbones were protruding, and his shape was like a skeleton. Fortunately, there was no shortage of water in the cell. As long as there was water, even if there was fierce competition for food in the cell, there were few cases of starvation. After solitary confinement, Dean still went crazy from time to time, beating the steel column or tearing the straw mat. As time went by, his symptoms gradually eased. Occasionally, he would act up and make a big fuss, talking nonsense, and cursing the people in other cells. However, the names he cursed were different. The people in the cell knew that Dean was crazy, but they didn't care about him. At the same time, they felt sorry for him, as if they saw their own end in the near future from Dean. Gradually, as Dean's condition stabilized, he was assigned to work once a week. After all, the prison didn't keep idle people. After another 6 months, it was the second year of Dean's imprisonment. Chapter 151. This practice naturally caused Dean to be beaten up. He resisted and was dragged out by more jailers. He was tortured until he was dying and thrown back to the prison. Another 6 months passed. The jailers gradually became too lazy to pay attention to a madman like Dean. It was not interesting to torture a madman. The painful moans in their ears did not have the slightest sense of accomplishment. If Dean was not occasionally stable and could barely work, they would be too lazy to send food to Dean and let him fend for himself. At night, after dinner, there was a burst of moaning in the cell again. In a dark and damp cell behind the corridor, Dean was squatting in front of the urinal. However, his squatting posture was reversed. In this way, the feces would accumulate in the urinal and need to be flushed down with water. On the steel pillars outside his cage, torn straw mats and bedding distributed during the black snow season were scattered in a mess. After all, this was the lake prison. During the black snow season, the air was extremely cold. If the bedding was not distributed, the prisoners who ate little and were often tortured would almost die. At this moment, the bedding was scattered on the steel column, but it formed a wonderful angle, blocking his urinal and bathing position. Therefore, unless they deliberately looked close to the gap, no one would know what Dean was doing in front of the cesspool. They saw Dean squatting in front of the urinal with his head down. One of his hands touched the bottom of his buttocks and kept digging. At the same time, he took a deep breath. After a moment, sparse feces came out. Because he ate little, almost all of it was water. However, a long, hard object fell out of the feces. Dean looked around. The darkness did not affect his vision. Seeing that no one was paying attention to him, he immediately grabbed the object and washed it in the bucket next to him. It was a piece of bee skin that had been corroded to the point of being tattered. It was tied tightly by a rope made of thick linen thread. He untied the rope and shook off the half-digested skin and flesh. A sharp knife fell from the inside. Dean picked up the knife and immediately snorted a few times. Then he roared and cursed incoherently. As he cursed, he bent down and quickly moved the urinal away. The inlaid areas around the urinal had long been cut open, but when he lifted it up, it would still make a sound, but it was covered by his cursing. At the same time, Dean drilled into a small path behind the urinal. He gradually stopped cursing, but his body was still on the ground. From time to time, he would curse a few times until he felt that it was enough. Then he sank into the hole. It was an extremely narrow but deep pit right next to the excrement pipe. At first, Dean's plan was to climb out of the excrement pipe. In his conception of the prison model, the excrement pipe should go straight to the bottom of the prison and then be buried in the bottom of the lake. It should go somewhere outside the lake and not to the bottom of the lake. Because if they were at the bottom of the lake, the water pressure would rush in and drown the prison. Therefore, this was definitely the only safe escape route in the prison. It was also the weakest part of the design of the whole prison. However, to his disappointment and even despair, the vertical excrement pipe leading to the bottom of the prison was not big. Even though he was hungry and skinny, he still couldn't drill into the pipe. Moreover, the pipe was made of steel and couldn't be destroyed. Therefore, he could only take the risk and use the weekly work opportunity to steal the tools from the workroom and dig another passage. After half a year of digging, the narrow passage had a depth of more than 10 meters, equivalent to the height of 1.5 floors of the prison. Whether it was the thickness of the walls or the thickness of each floor, they had been reinforced. Whether it was stability or defense, it was far higher than ordinary prisons. This was the biggest advantage of the prison, but at the moment, it was used by Dean. If the wall was too thin, it would be similar to an ordinary building. Naturally, there would be no opportunity for him to dig, and it would be easy to be noticed. But the wall was too thick. According to the thickness of the ground, the wall was at least 5 meters thick. It was enough for him to dig a shelter. Although the wall was very thick, Dean still didn't dare to cause too much movement. He carefully used the blade to poke out the soil and stones. In the blink of an eye, most of the night passed. Dean moved the soil and stones bit by bit. The passage was too narrow, so he went back and forth several times. Seeing that the others had fallen asleep, he immediately threw the stones and soil into the bucket and soaked them. At the same time, he hid some of the harder stones on the ground, waiting for the right opportunity to use them. When digging a tunnel, the most difficult thing was to deal with the soil and stones that were dug out. He wanted to secretly transport them to the workroom, but the inside was relatively clean. If there were more stones and soil on the ground, it would inevitably be conspicuous. So he dispelled the idea. After a few hours, the others gradually woke up. Dean saw that the soaked stones and soil became soft after soaking in the water. He immediately poured them out and carefully crushed them together. He slowly ground them until the soil became a paste and the stones became small sand-like fragments. Then he slowly smeared the ground and stones all over the prison. The smearing was very uniform. Because Dean was often crazy, the jailers rarely approached the cell. Every time they left the bread, no one noticed that the overall height of the cell was slightly higher than the other cells by a few centimeters. The internal space was also a lot more horizontal. If you looked from the next cell, you would be shocked to find that the wall of Dean's cell was much thicker than the other cells. However, the wall was blocked by Dean's torn straw mats, blocking his line of sight. The straw mat had been blocked here for more than half a year. The last time a person in the next cell wanted to secretly take it away, Dean found out in time. He rushed over to grab the person's arm and almost tore it off. Since then, the people in the next cell no longer dared to approach Dean's cell. Moreover, they were used to the straw mat. After smearing, Dean closed his eyes and rested for a while. When he was almost asleep, he was awakened by the voices of the people in the other cells. He immediately grabbed the harder and larger stones next to him, cursed, and threw them. The stones hit the other cells. Suddenly, there was a burst of cursing. They knew that the madman was sick again. Dean threw the stones randomly. After throwing the stones, he still grabbed the steel column and roared. He hit the steel column with his head. It seemed that he wanted to break free. After a while, he gradually calmed down and continued to sleep. The people in the cell who were thrown stones felt helpless. They cursed a few words, but did not dare to fight back. It was not necessary to anger a madman. Moreover, Dean was not an ordinary madman. They could only throw the stones thrown by Dean to the corner of their cell and ignore it. After all, this kind of thing did not happen in a day or two. They secretly thought that if Dean damaged the ground too much, sooner or later he would be beaten by the jailers. Chapter 152. Noon. 81. Central Plains. The people in the cells were waiting for the jailer to deliver the food. Suddenly, there was a shock from above. At the same time, there was a lot of noise from far away. Occasionally, they could hear the sound of metal colliding. The people in the cell were surprised. The soundproofing effect of the prison was excellent. The sound could be heard from above. It was obvious that the noise outside was monstrous. What's going on? The prisoners were puzzled and asked each other. A middle-aged man in the cell was surprised. Most likely someone has come to break the prison. Break the prison? Everyone was surprised and pleasantly surprised. Great. Maybe we will have the opportunity to rush out. The food hasn't been delivered yet. I guess the people outside are a mess. Jean frowned as he heard the excited discussion of the prisoners. He said, "A few days ago, I heard from the jailer that a senior hunter has been imprisoned in the third layer of the prison. Is it possible that they are coming to break this senior hunter?" "It is possible." Scar, who had a good relationship with him, nodded and said, "However, it will be very difficult for them to rush in. The magic beast lake outside can organize large-scale attacks. If they want to come to the front of the prison, they can only sneak attack along the corridor. But the checkpoints along the way are very strict. Even if they bribe the prison guards, it will be very difficult." The other leaders nodded. It was not the first time they had seen such a thing, so they were not as excited as the others. They knew that this prison was known as the #1 prison. Its defense was so tight that it could be called as a war fortress. Dean had woken up but was still lying on the ground. His expression was very calm as he listened to the discussion of others. On the ground, Thornflower Prison Castle. Two figures were standing in the watchtower above the castle. One of them was tall and straight. He was holding a telescope in his hand. He was looking at the hundreds of invading figures outside the lake. The scale of the invading figures was equivalent to a small army. They are well trained. They should have planned for a long time. The middle-aged man put down the telescope and chuckled. Behind him was a butler with a black top hat and a mustache. He said with a smile, "Unfortunately, they didn't train their brains well. It's not that their brains aren't trained well. It's just that the people commanding them don't have such a thing. The butler with the top hat smiled and said they were able to pass through the border fortress and our defense line to come here. They must have bribed someone from the military in our prison. I'll go and find those greedy mice later. The stalwart middle-aged man nodded slightly. His hawk-like eyes overlooked the entire lake outside the prison, as well as the battlefield by the lake. He said softly, "Heart of the tiger, smell the rose. A rose may be beautiful, but it has thorns on its stem." The butler in the tall hat continued with a smile. The middle-aged man nodded and said, "Is my tea ready? Just waiting for you to enjoy." The butler said respectfully. The jailbreak outside gradually subsided after a few hours. Everyone in the cell raised their heads and looked at the door, expecting to see an unfamiliar figure. However, when the door was pushed open, it was still the cold faces of the two jailers. At this point, everyone couldn't help but feel disappointed, knowing that the jailbreak had failed. This episode did not affect Dean. In the evening, he continued to jump into the tunnel and carefully dug the soil. In the blink of an eye, Dean had been in prison for 3 years. Black snowflakes drifted down from the lead-gray nuclear radiation clouds in the sky. They were relatively heavy, and they landed on the ground outside, dyeing the ground black. Many open-air orchards and farms had already set up sheds before the start of the season to prevent them from being damaged by the black snow. The weather was too cold. The prisoners in the cells huddled together to keep each other warm. In the evening, the jailers hurriedly came over to distribute the food. They shrunk their bodies into thick cotton-padded jackets and left the cell. Dean was given 3 pieces of black bread during the black snow season. He slowly ate them. Most of the prisoners were asleep. He took off his prison uniform and put on the back of the wall. He made a side-lying position. After doing all this, he opened the urinal and slid into the deep pit quietly. The rough pit rubbed against his skin, and it was bone-chilling. He slid all the way down, and when he passed by the workshop on the 2nd floor, he roughly estimated the height of each floor. When he reached the bottom, he immediately felt the cold lake water seeping into his feet. At this moment, he was already standing on the lowest floor of the prison. The depth of the pit is about 25 meters. There is also a torture chamber above it. The depth of the entire prison should be about 35 meters. There are only 2 layers of prison below the workshop. Senior hunters and trial knights are held in the lowest layer. Feng Lin continued. The strongest person in the first layer is a primary hunter. Old Jean is a primary hunter who has committed a crime and was imprisoned. Dean bent down to pick up the chisel at the bottom of the lake. This chisel was used to chisel the monster's sharp teeth. He swallowed it and brought it out. The progress of digging the pit was greatly improved. Whenever he thought of the fact that there was a senior hunter like Glenn living in the wall next to the pit, his heart would rejoice. Fortunately, his hunter title in the consortium was only primary. If he became an intermediate hunter, then he would be locked up in the penultimate layer. Although the distance of the wall would be shortened, but the punishment that an intermediate hunter would have to face was completely different from the first layer. Dudian had heard from Scar that the first level was just the piercing of the steel nails and the crippling of the arms. The other 2 levels were far more terrible than this. Even if a senior hunter came here, he would become a complete waste. In the narrow passage, Dean bent down in a difficult position and put his hand into the water to dig the soil. Dean had poured water into the pit before he reached the bottom of the prison. First, he hoped that the water would soak and soften the soil and rocks. Second, he wanted to cut the wall in the water so that the sound would be greatly reduced to avoid being heard. Now that the lake water had seeped in, he didn't have to pour water himself. After all, if he used too much water, it would inevitably arouse suspicion. After a moment, Dean followed the pipe and chiseled on a hard object. He was happy and immediately accelerated the speed. Soon, the shape of the hard object was revealed. It was an elliptical metal, although only a small part of it was exposed, but from the elliptical shape, if it was a pipe, the diameter would be large enough to accommodate him. However, when Dean saw the elliptical metal, he was not excited but stunned. He suddenly thought of something he had missed. The reinforced concrete had not been manufactured yet. Although the main excrement pipe of the entire prison was buried at the bottom of the lake, its defense was extremely terrifying due to the strong water pressure it had to withstand. How to break it? Dean was silent for a moment. He dug the soil next to the small piece of elliptical metal, exposing about half a meter of the elliptical metal. The curvature was still very small. It showed that the diameter of the pipe itself could even allow him to walk upright inside. He grabbed a stone and gently knocked on the metal pipe. After a few knocks, he immediately listened. After hearing the response inside, the last glimmer of hope on his face was also gloomy. As he guessed, there should be some filler in this metal pipe to adjust the water pressure. Under the filler, there should be a metal pipe. That metal pipe was the real excrement pipe. Dean grabbed a harder stone and smashed it in the water. Bang! The stone hit the metal pipe. The echo was very light, as if it hit a steel wall. Dean smashed a few times in a row. The stone was shattered, but the metal pipe was not damaged. There was no small dent. Dean angrily punched the metal pipe. The force of the shock made his shoulder hurt. After a long time, he calmed down a little. He picked up the chisel and continued to chisel along the side of the pipe. The soil at the bottom of the lake is soft, so the speed of chiseling will be very fast. After leaving the prison, I don't have to worry about the impact of the sound. If I dig with all my strength, I should be able to dig to the outside of the lake before the 5-year execution. Dean calculated in his heart and continued to dig. Half a month passed. Dean considered that the end of the pipe would be guarded by the prison guards. Although this possibility was extremely low, he still chose to dig in the opposite direction. In just half a month, Dean had dug a horizontal passage of 3 meters in the depth of the bottom of the lake. He could still vaguely remember what he saw on the corridor when he first entered the prison. The prison was in the middle of the lake, and the radius of the lake was about 300 meters. His daily progress was about 1 meter. In a year's time, he would be able to dig a tunnel that led directly to the lake. The only thing he worried about was that the mud at the bottom of the lake would collapse and crush the passage. Fortunately, he could use the excrement pipe as a marker. He dug a pit 4 or 5 meters below the excrement pipe. The surrounding soil was dry and hard, so the probability of being crushed by the mud was very low. Moreover, when he dug the passage, he would put some hard stones in the passage as beams. Although it was troublesome to go in and out every time, it could increase the safety of the passage. Although digging a passage was the most common way to escape from prison. Most people in the prison could think of this, but there were almost no people who could do it. Even the senior hunters at the bottom of the prison couldn't do it. They were closely guarded by people in turns. Their bodies were tortured, and they were weaker than Dean. After all, their titles allowed them to get enough torture and precautions. There was no chance for them to act, and even if they got the opportunity, they didn't have the tools. Taking a step back, even if they stole the tools like Dean, it would be difficult for them to dig a passage hundreds of meters deep. After all, the dark vision belonged to Dean's magic mark ability. If there was no vision in the dark, it was almost impossible to dig a parallel passage with closed eyes. The courage, the brain, the opportunity to get the tools, and their own ability to escape from the bottom of the lake. If any of these were missing, it would be difficult to successfully escape from prison. Bang! The knife in Dean's hand stabbed into the rock wall. In vain, the rock wall suddenly became slippery. Chapter 153. Dean was slightly surprised. 8 Omega. 1 Chinese net at this time, the slippery rock wall suddenly protruded a sharp thing, like scales. It suddenly stretched out from under the rock, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth, and rushed to bite Dean. This time Dean saw it clearly. It turned out to be a monster with a rock-like cuticle. Seeing it rushing over, he hurriedly raised his hand and punched the part above the sharp teeth, which was also the part that Dean thought was the head. Bang! His left hand hit the top without feeling, but the recoil force affected his left shoulder blade. The pain made him gasp, and, at the same time, he hurriedly retreated. The thing screamed in pain and rushed toward Dean angrily. Dean hurriedly held the knife in his hand and stabbed it. The knife stabbed its scales, but did not cause the slightest damage. Although the knife had only been used for less than a week, it had been so worn that it could not even cut the skin of an ordinary person. The thing shook its head and rushed to Dean's arm. His left hand was bitten, but there was no pain. Dean was anxious and hurriedly raised his right hand to beat it. This thing was like a small crocodile with short claws, a flat body, and hard scales. Dean was pierced by the steel nails, and his right hand could not exert strength. He could only watch its sharp teeth biting into his left arm, getting deeper and deeper. Dean quickly touched its head with his fingers and suddenly found a soft cuticle seam and immediately dug inside. This gap seemed to be its weakness. It immediately let go of Dean's mouth and shrank back. Dean saw this and hurriedly caught its short claws. His right hand pressed on its mouth, and at the same time, his body fell down, using the weight of his body to make it unable to open its mouth. The thing was pressed under Dean's body, struggling hard, but it was not strong enough to push Dean away. Dean found the gap in the soft armor that he had touched before and tore it with his left hand. The thing struggled fiercely in pain, but its left hand had no feeling, so it could exert all of Dean's strength. Without waiting for it to struggle too much, it suddenly tore the gap of the soft armor, and blood sprayed from inside. The struggling action of the thing suddenly froze, and then slowly struggled, and finally gradually stopped moving. Dean was relieved, only to feel cold sweat on his back. He slowly crawled over and looked down. He saw that the thing was about 1.5 meters long, and its whole body was covered with rock-colored scales. The raised particles were very similar to rocks, and its body temperature was also very cold. It belonged to a cold-blooded monster. This appearance, a bit like a stone beast, Dean looked at it a few times, and suddenly remembered the monster he had seen. This stone beast, like the Black Weaver that Glenn had hunted, had the ability to drill into the ground. Moreover, in terms of drilling, the stone beast was 3 points stronger than the Black Weaver. It was a monster that was completely active in the ground and could live in the soil. Unlike the Black Weaver, although it could drill into the ground, it was a monster that lived on the ground. Among the monsters outside the giant wall, the stone beast is one of the few monsters that can enter the giant wall. However, this stone beast's hunting level is relatively low, only level 6. Its combat ability is similar to ordinary undead. The reason why it is rated as level 6 is because of its ability to drill into the ground. This life-saving ability is unique. Even if the hunting level is 20 or 30 large monsters, it will be difficult to kill it. After knowing the identity of this thing, Dean also understood why he was able to kill it. His heart secretly rejoiced. Fortunately, he accidentally destroyed its vital point, the breathing hole. Sitting on the body of the stone beast to rest for a moment, Dean looked at the broken knife in his hand and suddenly thought of its claws. His eyes could not help but light up and immediately grabbed its short claws. He saw that the nails on the claws were like a few sharp bones, extremely hard, thin, and curved, very suitable for digging the earth. He was pleasantly surprised and immediately had an idea. 2 days later, Dean once again came to the underground passage. The body of the stone beast had some signs of decay. Dean held the knife that he brought from the workroom and cut off its 4 claws. At the same time, he stripped off the scales on its head and then dug a hole and buried its body in it so that the smell of decay would not fill the entire passage. After doing this, Dean held the claws of the stone beast and began to dig the earth. It is indeed a monster that can drill into the ground. Dean felt the speed of digging the earth, and his heart was very surprised. The efficiency was more than 10 times faster than before. After a few days, Dean encountered another stone beast, and its size was smaller than the previous one. After a fierce fight, he killed it. Now is the black snow season. These stone beasts ran to the rock strata at the bottom of the lake to stay warm. I don't know how many more I will encounter. Dean was a little distressed. The claws of the stone beast were extremely durable. The claws of the previous one were enough for him to dig a passage. Therefore, other stone beasts were all obstacles and trouble for him. Moreover, there must be a king in a group. If he encountered the king of the stone beast, he estimated that he would become the other's dinner. Now that he had the claws of the stone beast in hand, Dean was not in a hurry. At the moment, it was already the end of the season. He patiently waited for more than a month, and the black snow season finally passed. During this month of cultivation, his body also recovered a lot. After the black snow season passed, and the air warmed up, he continued to dig the earth. In the blink of an eye, 2 months passed. 2 young jailers dragged a cart to deliver the food. They threw the bread in the cart into each cell. Seeing the people in these cells pick up and eat it with great care, they had some perverted pleasure in their hearts. When they came to a cell at the end of the corridor, the jailer picked up the last piece of bread and threw it into the cell. He found that there were 2 pieces of bread on the floor of the cell, which were left by him last night. He couldn't help but frown and sneer. It's better to starve to death if you don't eat it. It was not the first time he saw such a situation. As early as a year ago, when he came to deliver the food, he saw the bread thrown on the ground, but was not picked up and eaten. At first, he thought that there was a change in the cell. When he opened the cell, he saw the madman inside jump out, yelling at him and punching him. Later, he gradually got used to it. Anyway, in a day or two, when the madman was hungry, he would naturally come to pick up the bread. He turned the cart and left the prison with his companion. The next day, noon, the jailer was in a good mood. Today, he was going to play a game. As before, he would watch the performance with bread as payment. Chapter 154. The jailer frowned and looked into the cell. Even the light from the nearest oil lamp was incomparably dim. In this hazy darkness, he could vaguely see a figure lying on his side in the cell, seemingly sleeping. "Come over and eat." The guard shouted in a bad mood. Seeing that the figure did not respond, he pushed the cart and left. Outside the prison, the heavy rain was pitter-patter. The black snow season had just passed. At the beginning of the rainy season, the rain was extremely frequent. The rain covered the world in a curtain of rain, and everything was hazy. At the edge of the lake, there was a sudden movement on a patch of grass where rainwater trickled down. A patch of grass rose up slightly, revealing a pair of deep black eyes that looked around. Although there was the interference of the heavy rain, he could still see the isolated castle in the middle of the lake in the distance, and his position was on the left side of the castle. He glanced at the direction of the left castle watchtower. There were 2 vague figures standing guard there. After eating the bread the night before yesterday, I started to dig. After a whole day yesterday, I managed to dig all the way to noon today. Dean's eyes flashed. Tonight is the last chance. When the guard comes to deliver the meal, he will inevitably notice the abnormality. Even if there's a previous hint of the wolf is coming, he will certainly notice it by tomorrow noon. There is only half a day left. The plan to escape from the prison was basically a success, but he knew that the escape was only the first step. The real danger would officially come at this moment. He quickly reached out from the entrance of the cave and grabbed the surrounding weeds. A moment later, he slowly lifted the turf and climbed out. The weeds that he had grabbed were wrapped around his body. As he crawled, he grabbed the weeds along the way and covered his entire body in a patch of green. The heavy rain soaked his body. It was biting cold. He crawled faster and faster. When he looked back and saw that the whole castle was very vague, he immediately stood up and ran. After a long time, until he could no longer see the castle, Dean was a little relieved, but he still did not dare to stay. He dragged his tired and painful body and stepped on the grass barefoot. I don't know which suburb this Thornflower prison is in. Dean stopped and took a few breaths. He raised his hand to block the heavy rain and looked up at the sky. He saw faint thunder and lightning in the dark clouds. Although the sky was dim, he could still see a relatively bright place. It should be where the sun was. After calculating the time in his mind, Dean immediately knew his position at the moment. He said in his heart, "The giant wall is in the south, the inner wall is in the north. Go north." According to the direction of the sun, he found the position of the north and went north. The giant wall and the inner wall were like a equal sign. The outer side was the giant wall, and the inner side was the inner wall. The middle part was the three areas, the outskirts, and the radiation zone. Under the washing of the heavy rain, the mud on Dean's body was completely washed away. He grabbed some leaves and weeds along the way and twisted them into ropes as he walked. He used the leaves to cover his body so that he would not be infected by the cold. Who? In this wilderness, Dean walked alone. He stumbled along the way. The biting rain made his body cold. He struggled to move forward while sniffing his nose to sense the smell around him in case he bumped into the patrol guards outside the cell. After more than an hour, the rain finally stopped. Dean's body was a lot lighter. It didn't take long for him to see a border fortress. From the familiar trail outside the fortress, it was impressively a fortress leading to the commercial district. I didn't expect that this Thornflower prison was not set up in the slums or residential area, but in the wilderness of the commercial district. Dean's eyebrows slightly raised. He suddenly understood that if the prison was set up in the slums, it would be much easier for others to mobilize manpower to break the prison. After all, the border inspection in these two areas and the inspection of the various areas were far less strict than the commercial district. Invisibly, this was a line of defense to prevent a prison break. If the people who escaped from the prison wanted to re-enter the residential area, they would be blocked by the layers of defense. They could only wander in the wilderness or enter the radiation area. In that case, sooner or later, they would perish on their own. Looking at the sky, although the heavy rain had just stopped, the dark clouds did not disperse. It seemed that another heavy rain was brewing. Dean quietly returned along the original road, looking at the fortress from afar. He saw that the fortress wall was made of stone and sharp wood. It was more than 20 meters high. He could clearly smell that there were soldiers stationed at every distance. There are soldiers on the wall, and there are soldiers patrolling inside the wall. Dean stared at the high wall and fell into thought. Suddenly, he smelled two smells coming from the direction of the prison in the distance. One was the smell of a human, and the other was the smell of a horse. He was shocked. Are they coming to track me? He hurried away from the fortress wall and ran horizontally. After running for thousands of meters, he stopped. The smell was still running in the previous straight line. It did not change its direction because of the change of his position. He didn't perceive me, so he isn't chasing me. Dean's eyes flashed with a trace of coldness. Da-da! A black horse was galloping fast. A young man was sitting on the horse, and he kept whipping the black horse. When passing through a small forest, a figure jumped out of it. The black horse was startled and stopped hurriedly. Its front hooves were raised high, and it neighed. The young man on the horse was shocked. He did not hold on and suddenly rolled down. At the same time when he landed, the figure rushed over and pressed him to the ground. The figure held a hard stone in his hand and raised it and smashed it down. When the young man saw the face of the figure on him, his pupils shrank and he cried out in horror, "It's you, Puff!" The stone hit his head. Blood flowed from his head and he fainted. Dean lifted the stone and smashed it several times in a row until the sound of cracking was transmitted from his skull. He stopped and gasped for breath. At the same time, he turned over to the flustered black horse. He took the rope and tied it to a small tree next to him. Then he returned to the dead body of the young man. He glanced at the armor and immediately knew that it was from Thornflower Prison. Suddenly, he saw a roll on the waist of the young man, which was used to store letters on rainy days. Dean's eyes flashed. He opened the roll and saw a parchment inside. He pulled it out and shook it. Suddenly, he saw a portrait of himself. Below it was his resume. Dean, male, 16 years old. Wanted in the city. Anyone who provides valid information will be rewarded with 100 gold coins. After reading it, Dean silently tore up the wanted poster. His mouth twitched slightly. 100 gold coins. It seems that I'm still worth a lot of money. For ordinary people in residential areas, 100 gold coins was a huge sum of money that was difficult to earn in a lifetime. It's not dinner time yet. It's been quite some time since lunch. The jailer must have felt that something was wrong and returned to check. It's even earlier than expected. Fortunately, I intercepted the wanted poster halfway. Dean realized the urgency of the matter. Once the wanted poster was out, his actions would be greatly limited. Fortunately, the world had not entered the information age. It would take a lot of time for the wanted poster to be posted in all areas. He must finish his plan before the time. Dean stripped the young man's clothes and put on his underwear. The more prominent armor was discarded in the grass next to him. Then he threw the young man's body into the grass. As for pretending to be the young man and sneaking into the fortress, the armor was too different from his body shape. People with discerning eyes could see that it was asymmetrical and easy to be exposed. Afterward, Dean took the black horse into the woods next to him. He picked up a stone and smashed it to death to prevent it from being seen by passers-by. Chapter 155. Grabbing the gap between the boulders, Dean quietly climbed up the wall, 150 meters to the left and 150 meters to the right. A soldier is stationed every 300 meters. Dean sensed the smell. The place he chose was exactly in the middle of the two. As he climbed to the middle of the wall, dark clouds rolled over his head. Dean stuck to the wall and waited quietly. A moment later, a torrential downpour fell. Dean immediately took the opportunity to quietly grope up. As he climbed to the top of the sharp wood, he looked around and saw that the two soldiers had left and returned to the pavilion 5 miles away to take shelter from the rain. When it rained, the station soldiers would retreat and change from garrison to intermittent patrol. Dean seized the opportunity and quickly crossed the aisle on the high wall and climbed down from the other end. Although the smell was suppressed during the rain, he could still roughly sense it within a range of about 7 or 8 miles. He lowered his body and ran stealthily. Occasionally, when he ran into a patrol team, he couldn't avoid them, so he lay on the ground and hid in the rain. Although the rain was very harmful to the human body, he was already wet and couldn't care less. Half an hour later, in the outer edge of the commercial district, a figure was running in the drizzle. There were no pedestrians in the wilderness. After the rain stopped, he took off his clothes and wrung them out. Then he continued to wear them until he came to the nearest suburban town. "I'm back." Dean looked at the town with cold eyes. He silently said in his heart, and then quietly entered the town. He came to the town's post station and hired a horse from a boss. The boss saw that Dean was wearing wet clothes and felt a bit strange, but seeing that Dean had handed over silver coins, he didn't ask anything. He took 2 horses and gave them to Dean. Dean turned over and rode on one of the big horses. At the same time, he pulled the other horse's rope and galloped away. After leaving the town, Dean rode all the way along the suburban trail at full speed. He didn't enter the commercial district. There were many people on the street, and it would inevitably attract attention. Moreover, some streets prohibited horses unless they had aristocratic status. Along the suburban streets, all the way, Duddian rode 2 horses. Although it was a bit of a detour in the suburbs, and occasionally they would encounter attacks from wild wolves and porcupines, but the confidentiality was much higher. It's getting dark. Dean looked at the sky and urged the horse faster. 2 hours later, one of the 6 boundary walls between the commercial district and the residential district. In front of the boundary wall closest to the giant wall, there are not many people going in and out. At this moment, a black horse was galloping over. A thin figure was sitting on the horse. It slowed down on the path in front of the passage and followed the sparse crowd into the passage of the boundary wall. Dean, who was sitting on the horse, saw that there was no wanted poster on the boundary wall. He was relieved. He knew that the news hadn't reached here yet. It would save him a lot of effort. There was no inspection to enter the residential district from the commercial district, but a strict inspection was required to enter the commercial district from the residential district. Therefore, Dean rode through the passage safely. As for the other horse, he had already lost it on the way. Otherwise, it would be somewhat unusual and conspicuous for a person to carry 2 horses. After all, the wanted poster would be delivered sooner or later, and the pursuers would come sooner or later. If he was too conspicuous, it would be easy for the pursuers to track him down. After coming out of the passage, Dean slowly accelerated and galloped away again. Residential district. I don't know how Uncle and Aunt are. Have they been implicated by me? 3 years have passed. Well, Anne's legs still hurt in rainy days. Dean could not help but think of Jura and her husband as he galloped all the way. In addition to his biological parents and sister, Jura and her husband were the most guilty people in the world. However, he knew that with his current identity, it was not appropriate to appear in front of them. Moreover, he had no time to find them. The sky was dark. Dean galloped at full speed, trying to enter the slums before the curfew. A few hours later, Dean rode past the boundary wall leading to the slums. He was back to the slums. His keen sense of smell suddenly smelled the turbid air and all kinds of strange and unpleasant smells. He rode the exhausted black horse to the abandoned factory that Barton and the others had found. It was located on the outskirts of the slums. At the moment, it was curfew time. There were soldiers patrolling the streets. If they saw a pedestrian, they would be beaten. If it was serious, they would be detained for a few days. Halfway through the journey, Dean encountered the curfew patrol. He immediately abandoned the black horse and tied it to a shed post outside a hotel. Taking advantage of the darkness, he went to another street to take a detour. Because of his sense of smell, it was almost impossible for the curfew patrol to find him. A few hours later, Dean came to the abandoned factory on the outskirts of the slums. Weeds were everywhere. The abandoned factory was like a dark skeleton standing in the wilderness of weeds. Dean didn't smell the smell of Barton and others. He frowned slightly, but thinking that he hadn't come back for more than 3 years, it was normal that they were not here. He immediately pushed the weeds and entered the factory. The darkness didn't affect his vision. There were some weeds growing in the factory. It should be deserted for a while. He walked around and quickly found some materials that he had specified to Barton and others to buy. He didn't expect that after 3 years, these materials were still piled up here and hadn't been sold. Dean silently stroked the wooden crates that stored the materials. After a moment of silence, he found some coal and smeared it on his face. After that, he found a slightly clean place and lay down to rest. He had not slept for 2 days and 1 night from the time he dug the tunnel to the time he was on his way. He was completely exhausted. The next day, Dean woke up in a warm golden light. He left the abandoned factory and went to the square where he and Barton had contacted each other. He immediately saw that the square was engraved with special symbols that he had taught them. "Dean, we have bought the things. Dean, are you okay? Everyone is waiting for you. Dean, we are waiting for you at the Green Street, North District, Source Mountain Factory. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."